Section 11 of The Wolves of God and Other Fae Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Empty Sleeve. 1. The Gilmer brothers were a couple of fussy and pernickety old bachelors of a rather retiring, not to say timid, disposition. There was gray in the pointed beard of John the elder, and if any hair had remained to William, it would also certainly have been on the same shade. They had private means. Their main interest in life was the collection of violins, for which they had the instinctive flair of true connoisseurs. Neither John nor William, however, could play a single note. They could only pluck the open strings. The production of tone, so necessary before purchase, was done vicariously for them by another. The only objection they had to the big building in which they occupied the roomy top floor was that of Morgan, liftman and caretaker. Insisted on wearing a billycock with his uniform after 6 o'clock in the evening, with a result disastrous to the beauty of the universe. For Mr. Morgan, as they called him between themselves, had a round and pasty face on the top of a round and conical body. In view, however, of the man's other rare qualities, including his devotion to themselves, this objection was not serious. He had another peculiarity that amused them. On being found fault with, he explained nothing, but merely repeated the words of the complaint. "Water in the bath wasn't really hot this morning, Morgan."
"Water in the bath not really hot, was it, sir?"
Or from William, who was something of a faddist. "My jar of sour milk came up late yesterday, Morgan."
"Your jar of sour milk come up late, sir, yesterday?"
Since, however, the statement of a complaint invariably resulted in its remedy, the brothers had learned to look for no further explanation. Next morning the bath was hot. The sour milk was brought up punctually. The uniform and billycock hat, though, remained an eyesore and source of oppression. On this particular night, John Gilmer, the elder, returned from Masonic rehearsal, stepped into the lift, and found Mr. Morgan with his hand ready on the iron rope. "Fog's very thick outside," said Mr. John pleasantly, and the lift was a third of the way up before Morgan had completed his customary repetition.
"Fog very thick outside, yes, sir."
And Gilmer then asked casually if his brother were alone, and received the reply that Mr. Hyman had called and had not yet gone away. Now, this Mr. Hyman was a Hebrew, and, like themselves, a connoisseur in violins, but, unlike themselves, who only kept their specimens to look at, he was a skillful and exquisite player. He was the only person they ever permitted to handle their pedigree instruments, to take them from the glass cases where they reposed in silent splendor, and to draw the sound out of their wondrous painted hearts of golden varnish. The brothers loathed to see his fingers touch them, yet loved to hear their singing voices in the room, for the latter confirmed their sound judgment as collectors, and made them certain their money had been well spent. Hyman, however, made no attempt to conceal his contempt and hatred for the mere collector. The atmosphere of the room fairly pulsed with these opposing forces of silent emotion when Hyman played, and the Gilmers, alternately writhing and admiring, listened. The occasions, however, were not frequent. The Hebrew only came by invitation, and both brothers made a point of being in. It was a very formal proceeding, something of a sacred rite almost. John Gilmer, therefore, was considerably surprised by the information Morgan had supplied. For one thing, Hyman, he had understood, was away on the continent. "Still in there, you say?" he repeated after a moment's reflection.
"Still in there, Mr. John, sir."
Then, concealing his surprise from the liftman, he fell back upon his usual mild habit of complaining about the billycock hat and uniform. "You really should try and remember, Morgan," he said, though kindly, "that hat does not go well with that uniform." Morgan's pasty countenance betrayed no vestige of expression.
"That don't go well with the uniform, sir,"
he repeated, hanging up the disreputable bowler and replacing it with a gold-braided cap from the peg.
"No, sir, it don't do it,"
he added cryptically, smiling at the transformation thus effected. And the lift then halted with an abrupt jerk at the top floor. By somebody's carelessness, the landing was in darkness, and, to make things worse, Morgan, clumsily pulling the iron rope, happened to knock the billycock from its peg so that his sleeve, as he stooped to catch it, struck the switch and plunged the scene in a moment's complete obscurity. And it was then, in the act of stepping out before the light was turned on again, that John Gilmer stumbled against something that shot along the landing past the open door. First he thought it must be a child, then a man, then an animal. Its movement was rapid yet stealthy. Starting backwards instinctively to allow it room to pass, Gilmer collided in the darkness with Morgan, and Morgan incontinently screamed. There was a moment of stupid confusion. The heavy framework of the lift shook a little, as though something had stepped into it and then as quickly jumped out again. A rushing sound followed that resembled footsteps, yet at the same time was more like gliding. Someone in soft slippers or stockinged feet, greatly hurrying. Then came silence again. Morgan sprang to the landing and turned up the electric light. Mr. Gilmer at the same moment did likewise to the switch in the lift. Light flooded the scene. Nothing was visible. "Dog or cat or something, I suppose, wasn't it?" exclaimed Gilmer, following the man out and looking round with bewildered amazement upon a deserted landing. He knew quite well, even while he spoke, that the words were foolish.
"Dog or cat, yes, sir, or something," echoed Morgan, his eyes narrowed to pinpoints, then growing large, but his face stolid.
"The light should have been on," Mr. Gilmer spoke with a touch of severity. The little occurrence had curiously disturbed his equanimity. He felt annoyed, upset, uneasy. For a perceptible pause, the liftman made no reply, and his employer, looking up, saw that besides being flustered, he was white about the jaws. His voice, when he spoke, was without its normal assurance. This time he did not merely repeat, he explained.
"The light was on, sir, when last I come up," he said with emphasis, obviously speaking the truth. "Only a moment ago," he added.
Mr. Gilmer, for some reason, felt disinclined to press for explanations. He decided to ignore the matter. Then the lift plunged down again into the depths like a diving bell into water, and John Gilmer, pausing a moment first to reflect, let himself in softly with his latchkey and, after hanging up hat and coat in the hall, entered the big sitting room he and his brother shared in common. The December fog that covered London like a dirty blanket had penetrated, he saw, into the room. The objects in it were half shrouded in the familiar yellowish haze. 2. In dressing gown and slippers, William Gilmer, almost invisible in his armchair by the gas stove across the room, spoke at once. Through the thick atmosphere his face gleamed, showing an extinguished pipe hanging from his lips. His tone of voice conveyed emotion, an emotion he sought to suppress, of a quality, however, not easy to define. "Hyman's been here," he announced abruptly. "You must have met him. He's this very instant gone out." It was quite easy to see that something had happened, for scenes leave disturbance behind them in the atmosphere. But John made no immediate reference to this. He replied that he had seen no one, which was strictly true, and that his brother, thereupon sitting bolt upright in the chair, turned quickly and faced him. His skin, in the foggy air, seemed paler than before. "That's odd," he said nervously. "What's odd?" asked John. "That you didn't see anything. You ought to have run into one another on the doorstep." His eyes went peering about the room. He was distinctly ill at ease. "You're positive you saw no one? Did Morgan take him down before you came? Did Morgan see him?" He asked several questions at once. "On the contrary, Morgan told me he was still here with you. Hyman probably walked down and didn't take the lift at all," he replied. "That accounts for neither of us seeing him." He decided to say nothing about the occurrence in the lift, for his brother's nerves, he saw plainly, were on edge. William then stood up out of his chair, and the skin of his face changed its hue, for whereas a moment ago it was merely pale, it had now altered to a tint that lay somewhere between white and a livid gray. The man was fighting internal terror. For a moment these two brothers of middle age looked each other straight in the eye. Then John spoke. "What's wrong, Billy?" he asked quietly. "Something's upset you. What brought Hyman in this way unexpectedly? I thought he was still in Germany." The brothers, affectionate and sympathetic, understood one another perfectly. They had no secrets, yet for several minutes the younger one made no reply. It seemed difficult to choose his words, apparently. "Hyman played, I suppose, on the fiddles?" John helped him, wondering uneasily what was coming. He did not care much for the individual in question, though his talent was of such great use to them. The other nodded in the affirmative, then plunged into rapid speech, talking under his breath as though he feared someone might overhear. Glancing over his shoulder down the foggy room, he drew his brother close. "Hyman came," he began. "Unexpectedly. He hadn't written, and I hadn't asked him. You hadn't either, I suppose?" John shook his head. "When I came in from the dining room, I found him in the passage. The servant was taking away the dishes, and he had let himself in while the front door was ajar. Pretty cool, wasn't it?" "He's an original," said John, shrugging his shoulders. "And you welcomed him?" he asked. "I asked him in, of course. He explained he had something glorious for me to hear. Solinsky had played it in the afternoon, and he had bought the music since, but Solinsky's Strad hadn't the power. It's thin on the upper strings, you remember, unequal, patchy. And he said no instrument in the world could do it justice but our Joseph, the small Guarnerius, which he swears is the most perfect in the world." "And what was it? Did he play it?" asked John, growing more uneasy as he grew more interested. With relief, he glanced round and saw the matchless little instrument lying there safe and sound in its glass case near the door. "He played it. Divinely. A Zigeuner lullaby. A fine, passionate, rushing bit of inspiration, oddly misnamed lullaby, and fancy the fellow had memorized it already. He walked about the room on tiptoe while he played it, complaining of the light." "Complaining of the light." "Said the thing was crepuscular and needed dusk for its full effect. I turned the lights out one by one till finally there was only the glow of the gas logs. He insisted, that way he has with him, and then he got over me in another matter, insisting on using some special strings he had brought with him, and put them on, too, himself, thicker than the A&E we use." For, though neither Gilmer could produce a note, it was their pride that they kept their precious instruments in perfect condition for playing, choosing the exact thickness and quality of strings that suited the temperament of each violin, and the little Guarnerius in question always sang best, they held, with thin strings. "Infernal insolence!" exclaimed the listening brother, wondering what was coming next. "Played it well, though, didn't he, this lullaby thing?" he added, seeing that William hesitated. As he spoke, he went nearer, sitting down close beside him in a leather chair. "Magnificent! Pure fire of genius," was the reply with enthusiasm, the voice at the same time dropping lower. "Staccato, like a silver hammer, harmonics like flutes, clear, soft ringing, and the tone, well, the G-string was a baritone, and the upper registers creamy and mellow as a boy's voice. John," he added, "that Guarnerius is the very pick of the period, and—" Again he hesitated. "Hyman loves it. He'd give his soul to have it." The more John heard, the more uncomfortable it made him. He had always disliked this gifted Hebrew, for in his secret heart he knew that he always feared and distrusted him. Sometimes he had felt half afraid of him. The man's very forcible personality was too insistent to be pleasant. His type was of the dark and sinister kind, and he possessed a violent will that rarely failed of accomplishing its desire. "Wish I had heard the fellow play," he said at length, ignoring his brother's last remark, and going on to speak of the most matter-of-fact details he could think of. "Did he use the Dodd bow or the Tort? That Dodd I picked up last month, is the most perfectly balanced I have ever—" He stopped abruptly, for William had suddenly got upon his feet and was standing there searching the room with his eyes. A chill ran down John's spine as he watched him. "What is it, Billy?" he asked sharply. "Hear anything?" William continued to peer about him through the thick air. "Oh, nothing, probably," he said in an odd catch in his voice. "Only, I keep feeling as if there was somebody listening. Do you think perhaps—" He glanced over his shoulder. "There is someone at the door? I wish you'd have a look, John." John obeyed, though without great eagerness. Crossing the room slowly, he opened the door, then switched on the light. The passage leading past the bathrooms towards the bedrooms beyond was empty. The coats hung motionless from their pegs. "No one, of course," he said, as he closed the door and came back to the stove. He left the light burning in the passage. It was curious the way both brothers had this impression that they were not alone, though only one of them spoke of it. "Use the Dodd or the Tort, Billy? Which?" continued John in the most natural voice he could assume. But at that very same instant the water started to his eyes. His brother, he saw, was close upon the thing he really had to tell, but he had stuck fast. 3. By a great effort, John Gilmer composed himself and remained in his chair. With detailed elaboration, he lit a cigarette, staring hard at his brother over the flaring match while he did so. There he sat in his dressing gown and slippers by the fireplace, eyes downcast, fingers playing idly with the red tassel. The electric light cast heavy shadows across the face. In a flash, then, since emotion may sometimes express itself in attitude even better than in speech, the elder brother understood that Billy was about to tell him an unutterable thing. By instinct, he moved over to his side so that the same view of the room confronted him. "Out with it, old man," he said, with an effort to be natural. "Tell me what you saw." Billy shuffled slowly round, and the two sat side by side, facing the fog-draped chamber. "It was like this," he began softly, "only I was standing instead of sitting, looking over to that door, as you and I do now. Hyman moved to and fro in the faint glow of the gas logs against the far wall, playing that crepuscular thing in his most inspired sort of way, so that the music seemed to issue from himself rather than from the shining bit of wood under his chin, when I noticed something come over me that was—" he hesitated, searching for words. "That wasn't all due to the music," he finished abruptly. "His personality put a bit of hypnotism on you, eh?" William shrugged his shoulders. "The air was thickish with fog, and the light was dim, cast upwards upon him from the stove," he continued. "I admit all that, but there wasn't light enough to throw shadows, you see, and—" "Hyman looked queer?" The other helped him quickly. Billy nodded his head without turning. "Changed there, before my very eyes," he whispered it. "Turned animal." "Animal?" John felt his hair rising. "That's the only way I can put it. His face and hands and body turned otherwise than usual. I lost the sound of his feet. When the bow hand or the fingers on the strings passed into the light, they were—" He uttered a soft, shuddering little laugh. "Furry. Oddly divided, the fingers massed together. And he paced stealthily. I thought every instant the fiddle would drop with a crash and he would spring at me across the room. My dear chap. He moved with those big, lithe, striding steps one sees." John held his breath in the little pause, listening keenly. "One sees those big brutes make in the cages when their desire is aflame for food or escape, or fierce, passionate desire for anything they want with their whole nature." "The big felines," John whistled softly. "And every minute getting nearer and nearer to the door as though he meant to make a sudden rush for it and get out." "With the violin? Of course you stopped him." "In the end, but for a long time, I swear to you, I found it difficult to know what to do, even to move. I couldn't get my voice for words of any kind. It was like a spell." "It was a spell," suggested John firmly. "Then, as he moved, still playing," continued the other, "he seemed to grow smaller, to shrink down below the line of the gas. I thought I should lose sight of him altogether. I turned the light up suddenly. There he was, over by the door, crouching." "Playing on his knees, you mean?" William closed his eyes in an effort to visualize it again. "Crouching," he repeated at length, "close to the floor. At least, I think so. It all happened so quickly, and I felt so bewildered. It was hard to see straight. But at first I could have sworn he was half his natural size. I called to him. I think I swore at him. I forgot exactly. But I know he straightened up at once and stood before me down there in the light." He pointed across the room to the door. Eyes gleaming, face as white as chalk, perspiring like midsummer, and gradually filling out, straightening up, whatever you'd like to call it, to his natural size and appearance again. It was the most horrid thing I've ever seen." "As an animal, you saw him still?" "No, human again, only much smaller." "What did he say?" Billy reflected a moment. "Nothing that I can remember," he replied. "You see, it was all over in a few seconds. In the full light, I felt so foolish and nonplussed at first. To see him normal again baffled me. And before I could collect myself, he had let himself out into the passage, and I heard the front door slam. A minute later, the same second almost, it seemed you came in. I only remember grabbing the violin and getting it back safely under the glass case. The strings were still vibrating. The account was over. John asked no further questions, nor did he say a single word about the lift, Morgan, or the extinguished light on the landing. There fell a longish silence between the two men, and then, while they helped themselves to a generous supply of whiskey and soda before going to bed, John looked up and spoke. "If you agree, Billy," he said quietly, "I think I might write and suggest to Hyman that we shall no longer have need for his services." And Billy, acquiescing, added a sentence that expressed something of a singular dread lying but half concealed in the atmosphere of the room, if not in their minds as well. Putting it, however, in a way that need not offend him. "Of course, there's no need to be rude, is there?" Accordingly, next morning the letter was written, and John, saying nothing to his brother, took it round himself by hand to the Hebrew's rooms near Euston. The answer he dreaded was forthcoming. "Mr. Hyman's still away abroad," he was told, "but we're forwarding letters, yes, or I can give you his address if you'll prefer it." The letter went, therefore, to the number in Königstrasse, Munich, thus obtained. Then, on his way back from the insurance company, where he went to increase the sum that protected the small Guarnerius from loss by fire, accident, or theft, John Gilmer called at the offices of certain musical agents and ascertained that Selinsky, the violinist, was performing at that time in Munich. It was only some days later, though, by diligent inquiry, he made certain that at a concert on a certain date, the famous virtuoso had played a Zigeuner lullaby of his own composition. The very date, it turned out, on which he himself had been to the Masonic rehearsal at Mark Mason's hall. John, however, said nothing of these discoveries to his brother William. 4. It was about a week later when a reply to the letter came from Munich, a letter couched in somewhat offensive terms, though it contained neither words nor phrases that could actually be found fault with. Isidore Hyman was hurt and angry. On his return to London a month or so later, he proposed to call and talk the matter over. The offensive part of the letter lay, perhaps, in his definite assumption that he could persuade the brothers to resume the old relations. John, however, wrote a brief reply to the effect that they had decided to buy no new fiddles, their collection being complete. There would be no occasion for them to invite his services as a performer. This was final. No answer came, and the matter seemed to drop. Never for one moment, though, did it leave the consciousness of John Gilmer. Hyman had said that he would come, and come assuredly he would. He secretly gave Morgan instructions that he and his brother for the future were always out when the Hebrew presented himself. "He must have gone back to Germany, you see, almost at once after his visit here that night," observed William. John, however, making no reply. One night towards the middle of January, the two brothers came home together from a concert in Queen's Hall, and sat up later than usual in their sitting room, discussing over their whiskey and tobacco the merits of the pieces and performers. It must have been past 1 o'clock when they turned out the lights in the passage and retired to bed. The air was still and frosty, moonlight over the roofs, one of those sharp and dry winter nights that now seem to visit London rarely. "Like the old-fashioned days when we were boys," remarked William, pausing a moment by the passage window and looking out across the miles of silvery, sparkling roofs. "Yes," added John. "The ponds freezing hard in the fields, rime on the nursery windows, and the sound of a horse's hoofs coming down the road in the distance, eh?" They smiled at the memory, then said good night and separated. Their rooms were at opposite ends of the corridor. In between were the bathroom, dining room, and sitting room. It was a long, straggling flat. Half an hour later both brothers were sound asleep, the flat silent, only a dull murmur rising from the great city outside, and the moon sinking slowly to the level of the chimneys. Perhaps 2 hours passed, perhaps 3, when John Gilmer, sitting up in bed with a start, wide awake and frightened, knew that someone was moving about in one of the 3 rooms that lay between him and his brother. He had absolutely no idea why he should have been frightened, for there was no dream or nightmare memory that he brought over from unconsciousness, and yet he realized plainly that the fear he felt was by no means a foolish and unreasoning fear. It had a cause and a reason. Also, which made it worse, it was fully warranted. Something in his sleep, forgotten in the instant of waking, had happened that set every nerve in his body on the watch. He was positive only of two things. First, that it was the entrance of this person, moving so quietly there in the flat, that sent the chills down his spine, and secondly, that this person was not his brother William. John Gilmer was a timid man. The sight of a burglar, his eyes black-masked, suddenly confronting him in the passage would most likely have deprived him of all power of decision, until the burglar had either shot him or escaped. But on this occasion some instinct told him that it was no burglar, and that the acute distress he experienced was not due to any message of ordinary physical fear. The thing that had gained access to his flat while he slept had first come, he felt sure of it, into his room, and had passed very close to his own bed before going on. It had then doubtless gone to his brother's room, visiting them both stealthily to make sure they slept. And its mere passage through his room had been enough to wake him and set these drops of cold perspiration upon his skin. For it was, he felt in every fiber of his body, something hostile. The thought that it might at that very moment be in the room of his brother, however, brought him to his feet on the cold floor and set him moving with all the determination he could summon towards the door. He looked cautiously down an utterly dark passage, then crept on tiptoe along it. On the wall were old-fashioned weapons that had belonged to his father, and feeling a curved, sheathless sword that had come from some Turkish campaign of years gone by, his fingers closed tightly round it, and lifted it silently from the 3 hooks whereon it lay. He passed the doors of the bathroom and dining room, making instinctively for the big sitting room where the violins were kept in their glass cases. The cold nipped him. His eyes smarted with the effort to see in the darkness. Outside the closed door, he hesitated. Putting his ear to the crack, he listened. From within came a faint sound of someone moving. The same instant there rose the sharp, delicate ping of a violin string being plucked. And John Gilmer, with nerves that shook like the vibrations of that very string, opened the door wide with a fling and turned on the light at the same moment. The plucked string still echoed faintly in the air. The sensation that met him on the threshold was the well-known one that things had been going on in the room which his unexpected arrival had that instant put a stop to. A second earlier, and he would have discovered it all in the act. The atmosphere still held the feeling of rushing, silent movement with which the things had raced back to their normal motionless positions. The immobility of the furniture was a mere attitude hurriedly assumed, and the moment his back was turned, the whole business, whatever it might be, would begin again. With this presentment of the room, however, a purely imaginative one, came another, swiftly on its heels. For one of the objects, less swift than the rest, had not quite regained its attitude of repose. It still moved, below the window curtains on the right, not far from the shelf that bore the violins in their glass cases. He made out, slowly gliding along the floor. Then, even as his eye caught it, it came to rest. And while the cold perspiration broke out all over him afresh, he knew that this still moving item was the cause both of his waking and of his terror. This was the disturbance whose presence he had divined in the flat without actually hearing, and whose passage through his room, while he yet slept, had touched every nerve in his body as with ice. Clutching his Turkish sword tightly, he drew back with the utmost caution against the wall and watched. For the singular impression came to him that the movement was not that of a human being crouching, but rather of something that pertained to the animal world. He remembered, flash-like, the movements of reptiles, the stealth of the larger felines, the undulating glide of great snakes. For the moment, however, it did not move, and they faced one another. The other side of the room was but dimly lighted, and the noise he made, clicking up another electric lamp, brought the thing flying forward again, towards himself. At such a moment it seemed absurd to think of so small a detail, but he remembered his bare feet, and genuinely frightened, he leaped upon a chair and swished with his sword through the air about him. From this better point of view, with the increased light to aid him, he then saw two things. First, that the glass case usually covering the Guarnerius violin had been shifted, and secondly, that the moving object was slowly elongating itself into an upright position. Semi-erect, yet most oddly too, like a creature on its hind legs, it was coming swiftly towards him. It was making for the door, and escape. The confusion of ghostly fear was somehow upon him so that he was too bewildered to see clearly, but he had sufficient self-control, it seemed, to recover a certain power of action, for the moment the advancing figure was near enough for him to strike, that curved scimitar flashed and whirred about him, with such misdirected violence, however, that he not only failed to strike it even once, but at the same time lost his balance and fell forward from the chair whereon he perched, straight into it. And then came the most curious thing of all, for as he dropped, the figure also dropped, stooped low down, crouched, dwindled amazingly in size, and rushed past him close to the ground like an animal on all fours. John Gilmer screamed, for he could no longer contain himself. Stumbling over the chairs, he turned to follow, cutting and slashing wildly with his sword. He saw halfway down the darkened corridor beyond the scuttling outline of, apparently, an enormous cat. The door into the outer landing was somehow ajar, and the next second the beast was out, but not before the steel had fallen with a crashing blow upon the front disappearing leg, almost severing it from the body. It was dreadful. Turning up the lights as he went, he ran after it to the outer landing, but the thing he followed was already well away, and he heard on the floor below him the same odd gliding, slithering, stealthy sound, yet hurrying, that he had heard weeks before when something had passed him in the lift, and Morgan, in his terror, had likewise cried aloud. For a time he stood there on that dark landing, listening, thinking, trembling, then turned into the flat and shut the door. In the sitting room he carefully replaced the glass case over the treasured violin, puzzled to the point of foolishness, and strangely routed in his mind. For the violin itself, he saw, had been dragged several inches from its cushioned bed of plush. Next morning, however, he made no allusion to the occurrence of the night. His brother apparently had not been disturbed. 5. The only thing that called for explanation, an explanation not fully forthcoming, was the curious aspect of Mr. Morgan's countenance. The fact that this individual gave notice to the owners of the building, and at the end of the month left for a new post, which was of course known to both brothers, whereas the story he told in explanation of his face was known only to the one who questioned him about it, John. And John, for reasons best known to himself, did not pass it on to the other. Also for reasons best known to himself, he did not cross-question the liftman about those singular marks or report the matter to the police. Mr. Morgan's pasty visage was badly scratched, and there were red lines running from the cheek into the neck that had the appearance of having been produced by sharp points viciously applied. Claws. He had been disturbed by a noise in the hall, he said, about 3 a.m. A scuffle had ensued in the darkness, but the intruder had got clear away. "A cat or something of the kind, no doubt," suggested John Gilmore at the end of the brief recital. And Morgan replied in his usual way, "A cat or something of the kind, Mr. John, no doubt." All the same, he had not cared to risk a second encounter, but had departed to wear his billycock in uniform in a building less haunted. Hyman, meanwhile, made no attempt to call and talk over his dismissal. The reason for this was only apparent, however, several months later, when, quite by chance coming along Piccadilly in an omnibus, the brothers found themselves seated opposite to a man with a thick black beard and blue glasses. William Gilmer hastily rang the bell and got out, saying something half intelligible about feeling faint. John followed him. "Did you see who it was?" he whispered to his brother the moment they were safely on the pavement. John nodded. "Hyman, in spectacles. He's grown a beard, too." "Yes, but did you also notice?" "What?" "He had an empty sleeve." "An empty sleeve?" "Yes," said William. "He's lost an arm." There was a long pause before John spoke. At the door of their club, the older brother added, "Poor devil. He'll never again play on." Then suddenly changing the preposition, "with a pedigree violin." And that night in the flat, after William had gone to bed, he looked up a curious old volume he had once picked up on a second-hand bookstall, and read therein quaint descriptions of how the desire body of a violent man may assume animal shape, operate on concrete matter even at a distance, and further, how a wound inflicted thereon can reproduce itself upon its physical counterpart, by means of the mysterious so-called phenomenon of repercussion. End of section 11. The Empty Sleeve. Section 12 of The Wolves of God and Other Fae Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Wireless confusion. "Good night, Uncle," whispered the child as she climbed onto his knee and gave him a resounding kiss. "It's time for me to disapop into bed. At least, so Mother says." "Disapop, then," he replied, returning her kiss. "Although I doubt—" He hesitated. He remembered the word was her father's invention, descriptive of the way rabbits pop into their holes and disappear, and the way good children should leave the room the instant bedtime was announced. The father, his twin brother, seemed to enter the room and stand beside them. "Then give me another kiss and disapop," he said quickly. The child obeyed the first part of his injunction, but had not obeyed the second when the queer thing happened. She had not left his knee. He was still holding her at the full stretch of both arms. He was staring into her laughing eyes, when she suddenly went far away into an extraordinary distance. She retired. Minute, tiny, but still in perfect proportion and clear as before, she was withdrawn in space till she was small as a doll. He saw his own hands holding her, and they too were minute. Down this long corridor of space, as it were, he saw her diminutive figure. "Uncle," she cried, yet her voice was loud as before, "but what a funny face! You're pretending you've seen a ghost." And she was gone from his knee and from the room, the door closing quietly behind her. He saw her cross the floor, a tiny figure. Then, just as she reached the door, she became of normal size again, as if she crossed a line. He felt dizzy. The loud voice close to his ear, issuing from a diminutive figure half a mile away, had a distressing effect upon him. He knew a curious qualm as he sat there in the dark. He heard the wind walking round the house, trying the doors and windows. He was troubled by a memory he could not seize. Yet the emotion instantly resolved itself into one of personal anxiety. Something had gone wrong with his eyes. Sight, his most precious possession as an artist, was of course affected. He was conscious of a little trembling in him, as he once began trying his sight at various objects. His hands, the high ceiling, the trees dim in the twilight on the lawn outside. He opened a book and read half a dozen lines at changing distances. Finally, he stared carefully at the second hand of his watch. "Right as a trivet!" he exclaimed aloud. He emitted a long sigh. He was immensely relieved. "Nothing wrong with my eyes." He thought about the actual occurrence a great deal. He felt as puzzled as any other normal person must have felt. While he held the child actually in his arms, gripping her with both hands, he had seen her suddenly half a mile away. "Half a mile," he repeated under his breath. "Why, it was even more. It was easily a mile." It had been exactly as though he suddenly looked at her down the wrong end of a powerful telescope. It had really happened. He could not explain it. There was no more to be said. This was the first time it happened to him. At the theater, a week later, when the phenomenon was repeated, the stage he was watching fixedly at the moment went far away, as though he saw it from a long way off. The distance, so far as he could judge, was the same as before, about a mile. It was an Eastern scene, realistically costumed and produced, that, without an instant's warning, withdrew. The entire stage went with it, although he did not actually see it go. He did not see movement, that is. It was suddenly remote. While yet the actors' voices, the orchestra, the general hubbub retained their normal volume. He experienced again the distressing dizziness. He closed his eyes, covering them with his hand, then rubbing the eyeballs slightly. And when he looked up the next minute, the world was as it should be, as it had been, at any rate. Unwilling to experience a repetition of the thing in a public place, however, and fortunately, being alone, he left the theater at the end of the act. Twice this happened to him, once with an individual, his brother's child, and once with a landscape, an eastern stage scene. Both occurrences were within the week, during which time he had been considering a visit to the oculist, though without putting his decision into execution. He was the kind of man that dreaded doctors, dentists, oculists, always postponing, always finding reasons for delay. He found reasons now, the chief among them being an unwelcome one, that it was perhaps a brain specialist, rather than an oculist, he ought to consult. This particular notion hung unpleasantly about his mind when, the day after the theater visit, the thing recurred, but with a startling difference. While idly watching a bluebottle fly that climbed the window pane with remorseless industry, only to slip down again at the very instant when escape into the open air was within its reach, the fly grew abruptly into gigantic proportions, became blurred and indistinct as it did so, covering the entire pane with its furry, dark, ugly mass, and frightened him so that he stepped back with a cry and nearly lost his balance altogether. He collapsed into a chair. He listened with closed eyes. The metallic buzzing was audible, a small, exasperating sound, ordinarily unable to stir any emotion beyond a mild annoyance. Yet it was terrible. That so huge an insect should make so faint a sound seemed to him terrible. At length he cautiously opened his eyes. The fly was of normal size once more. He hastily flicked it out of the window. An hour later he was talking with the famous oculist in Harley Street about the advisability of starting reading glasses. He found it difficult to relate the rest. A curious shyness restrained him. "Your optic nerves might belong to a man of 20, was the verdict. "Both are perfect, but at your age it is wise to save the sight as much as possible. There is a slight astigmatism." And a prescription for the glasses was written out. It was only when paying the fee, and as a means of drawing attention from the awkward moment, that his story found expression. It seemed to come out in spite of himself. He made light of it even then, telling it without conviction. It seemed foolish, suddenly, as he told it. "How very odd," observed the oculist vaguely. "Dear me, yes, curious indeed. But that's nothing. Either it was no concern of his, or he deemed it negligible. His only other confidant was a friend of psychological tendencies, who was interested and eager to explain. It is on the instant plausible explanation of anything and everything that the reputation of such folk depends. This one was true to type. "A spontaneous invention, my dear fellow. A pictorial rendering of your thought. You are a painter, aren't you? Well, this is merely a rendering in picture form of—" He paused for effect. The other hung upon his words. "Of the odd expression, disopop." "Ah!" exclaimed the painter. "You see everything pictorially, of course, don't you?" "Yes, as a rule." "There you have it. Your painter's psychology saw the child disopopping, that's all." "And the fly?" But the fly was easily explained, since it was merely the process reversed. "Once a process has established itself in your mind, you see, it may act in either direction. When a madman says, 'I'm afraid Smith will do me an injury,' it means, 'I will do an injury to Smith.'" And he repeated with finality, "That's it." The explanations were not very satisfactory, the illustration even tactless, but then the problem had not been stated quite fully. Neither to the oculist nor the other had all the facts been given. The same shyness had been a restraining influence in both cases. A detail had been omitted. And this detail was that he connected the occurrences somehow with his brother, whom the war had taken. The phenomenon made one more appearance, the last, before its character, its field of action rather altered. He was reading a book when the print became now large, now small. It blurred, grew remote and tiny, then so huge that a single word, a letter even, filled the whole page. He felt as if someone were playing optical tricks with the mechanism of his eyes, trying first one, then another focus. More curious still, the meaning of the words themselves became uncertain. He did not understand them any more. The sentences lost their meaning, as though he read a strange language or a language little known. The flash came then. Someone was using his eyes. Someone else was looking through them. No, it was not his brother. The idea was preposterous in any case. Yet he shivered again, as when he heard the walking wind, for an uncanny conviction came over him that it was someone who did not understand eyes, but was manipulating their mechanism experimentally. With the conviction came also this, that while not his brother, it was someone connected with his brother. Here, moreover, was an explanation of sorts, for if the supernatural existed, he had never troubled his head about it, he could accept this odd business as a manifestation and leave it at that. He did so, and his mind was eased. This was his attitude. The supernatural may exist. Why not? We cannot know, but we can watch. His eyes and brain, at any rate, were proved in good condition. He watched. No change of focus, no magnifying or diminishing came again. For some weeks he noticed nothing unusual of any kind, except that his mind often filled now with Eastern pictures. Their sudden eruption caught his attention, but no more than that. They were sometimes blurred and sometimes vivid. He had never been in the East. He attributed them to his constant thinking of his brother, missing in Mesopotamia these 6 months. Photographs in magazines and newspapers explained the rest. Yet the persistence of the pictures puzzled him. Tints beneath hot cloudless skies, palms, a stretch of desert, dry watercourses, camels, a mosque, a minaret. Typical snatches of this kind flashed into his mind with a sense of faint familiarity often. He knew again the return of a fugitive memory he could not seize. He kept a note of the dates, all of them subsequent to the day he read his brother's fate in the official roll of honor. Believed missing, now killed. Only when the original phenomenon returned, but in its altered form, did he stop the practice. The change then affected his life too fundamentally to trouble about mere dates and pictures. For the phenomenon, shifting its field of action, abruptly became mental. And the singular change of focus took place now in his mind. Events magnified or contracted themselves out of all relation with their intrinsic values. Sense of proportion went hopelessly astray. Love, hate, and fear experienced sudden intensification, or abrupt dwindling into nothing. The familiar everyday emotions, commonplace daily acts, suffered exaggerated enlargement or reduction into insignificance that threatened the stability of his personality. Fortunately, as stated, they were of brief duration. To examine them in detail were to touch the painful absurdities of incipient mania almost. That a lost collar stud could block his exasperated mind for hours, filling an entire day with emotion, while a deep affection of long standing could ebb towards the complete collapse suddenly, without apparent cause. It was the unexpected suddenness of Turkey's spectacular defeat that closed the painful symptoms. The armistice saw them go. He knew a quick relief he was unable to explain. The telegram that his brother was alive and safe came after his recovery of mental balance. It was a shock, but the phenomena had ceased before the shock. It was in the light of his brother's story that he reviewed the puzzling phenomenon described. The story was not more curious than many another, perhaps, yet the details were queer enough. That a wounded Turk to whom he gave water should have remembered gratitude was likely enough, for all travelers know that these men are kindly gentlemen at times, but that this Mohammedan peasant should have been later a member of the prisoner's escort and have provided the means of escape and concealment. Weeks in a dry watercourse, and months in a hut outside the town, seemed an incredible stroke of good fortune. He brought me food and water 3 times a week. I had no money to give him, so I gave him my Zeiss glasses. I taught him a bit of English, too, but he liked the glasses best. He was never tired of playing with them, making big and little, as he called it. He learned precious little English. My pair, weren't they? Interrupted his brother. My old climbing glasses? You were present to me when I was out, yes. So really, you helped me to save my life. I told the old Turk that. I was always thinking about you. And the Turk? No doubt. Through my mind, that is. At any rate, he asked a lot of questions about you. I showed him your photo. He died, poor chap. At least, they told me so. Probably they shot him. End of Section 12, Wireless Confusion. Section 13, of The Wolves of God and Other Faith Stories by Algernon Blackwood and Wilfred Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Confession. The fog swirled slowly round him, driven by a heavy movement of its own, for of course there was no wind. It hung in poisonous thick coils and loops. It rose and sank. No light penetrated it directly from the street lamp or motor car, though here and there some big shop window shed a glimmering patch upon its ever-shifting curtain. O'Reilly's eyes ached and smarted with the incessant effort to see a foot beyond his face. The optic nerve grew tired, and sight, accordingly, less accurate. He coughed as he shuffled forward cautiously through the choking gloom. Only the stifled rumble of crawling traffic persuaded him he was in a crowded city at all. This, and the vague outlines of groping figures, hugely magnified, emerging suddenly and disappearing again, as they fumbled along inch by inch towards uncertain destinations. The figures, however, were human beings. They were real. That much he knew. He heard their muffled voices, now close, now distant, strangely smothered always. He also heard the tapping of innumerable sticks, feeling for iron railings or the curb. These phantom outlines represented living people. He was not alone. It was the dread of finding himself quite alone that haunted him, for he was still unable to cross an open space without assistance. He had the physical strength. It was the mind that failed him. Midway, the panic terror might descend upon him. He would shake all over, his will dissolve. He would shriek for help, run wildly. Into traffic, probably, or, as they called it in his North Ontario home, throw a fit in the street before advancing wheels. He was not yet entirely cured, although under ordinary conditions he was safe enough, as Dr. Henry had assured him. When he left Regent's Park by tube an hour ago, the air was clear. The November sun shone brightly. The pale blue sky was cloudless, and the assumption that he could manage the journey across London town alone was justified. The following day he was to leave for Brighton for the week of final convalescence. This little preliminary test of his powers on a bright November afternoon was all to the good. Dr. Henry furnished minute instructions. "You change at Piccadilly Circus, without leaving the underground station, mind, and get out at South Kensington. You know the address of your VAD friend. Have your cup of tea with her, then come back the same way to Regent's Park. Come back before dark, say 6 o'clock at latest. It's better." He had described exactly what turns to take after leaving the station. So many to the right, so many to the left. It was a little confusing, but the distance was short. You can always ask. You can't possibly go wrong. The unexpected fog, however, now blurred these instructions in a confused jumble in his mind. The failure of outer sight reacted upon memory. The VAD, besides, had warned him her address was not easy to find the first time. The house lies in a backwater, but with your backwoods instincts you'll probably manage it better than any Londoner. She, too, had not calculated upon the fog. When O'Reilly came up the stairs at South Kensington Station, he emerged into such murky darkness that he thought he was still underground. An impenetrable world lay round him. Only a raw bite in the damp atmosphere told him he stood beneath an open sky. For some little time he stood and stared. A Canadian soldier, his home among clear, brilliant spaces, now face to face for the first time in his life with that thing he had so often read about. A bad London fog. With keenest interest and surprise, he enjoyed the novel spectacle for perhaps 10 minutes, watching the people arrive and vanish, and wondering why the station lights stopped dead the instant they touched the street. Then, with a sense of adventure, it cost an effort, he left the covered building and plunged into the opaque sea beyond. Repeating to himself the directions he had received, first to the right, second to the left, once more to the left, and so forth, he checked each turn, assuring himself it was impossible to go wrong. He made correct, if slow, progress, until someone blundered into him with an abrupt and startling question. "Is this right, do you know, for South Kensington Station?" It was the suddenness that startled him. One moment there was no one. The next they were face to face, another, and the stranger had vanished into the gloom with a courteous word of grateful thanks. But the little shock of interruption had put memory out of gear. Had he already turned twice to the right, or had he not? O'Reilly realized sharply he had forgotten his memorized instructions. He stood still, making strenuous efforts at recovery, but each effort left him more uncertain than before. 5 minutes later he was lost as hopelessly as any townsman who leaves his tent in the backwoods without blazing the trees to ensure finding his way back again. Even the sense of direction, so strong in him among his native forests, was completely gone. There were no stars. There was no wind, no smell, no sound of running water. There was nothing anywhere to guide him. Nothing but occasional dim outlines, groping, shuffling, emerging and disappearing in the eddying fog, but rarely coming within actual speaking, much less touching distance. He was lost utterly. More, he was alone. Yet not quite alone. The thing he dreaded most. There were figures still in his immediate neighborhood. They emerged, vanished, reappeared, dissolved. No, he was not quite alone. He saw these thickenings of the fog. He heard their voices, the tapping of their cautious sticks, their shuffling feet as well. They were real. They moved, it seemed, about him in a circle, never coming very close. But they're real, he said to himself aloud, betraying the weak point in his armor. They're human beings, right enough. I'm positive of that. He had never argued with Dr. Henry. He wanted to get well. He had obeyed implicitly, believing everything the doctor told him, up to a point. But he had always had his own idea about these figures, because among them were often enough his own pals from Somme, Gallipoli, the Mespot horror too, and he ought to know his own pals when he saw them. At the same time, he knew quite well he had been shocked, his being dislocated, half dissolved as it were, his system pushed into some lopsided condition that meant inaccurate registration. True, he grasped that perfectly. But in that shock and dislocation, had he not possibly picked up another gear? Were there not gaps and broken edges, pieces that no longer dovetailed, fitted as usual? Interstices, in a word? Yes, that was the word, interstices. Cracks, so to speak, between his perception of the outside world and his inner interpretation of these. Between memory and recognition? Between the various states of consciousness that usually dovetailed so neatly that the joints were normally imperceptible? His state, he well knew, was abnormal, but were his symptoms on that account unreal? Could not these interstices be used by others? When he saw his figures, he used to ask himself, are not these the real ones, and the others, the human beings, unreal? This question now revived in him with a new intensity. Were these figures in the fog real or unreal? The man who had asked the way to the station, was he not, after all, a shadow merely? By the use of his cane and foot and what of sight was left to him, he knew that he was on an island. A lamp-post stood up solid and straight beside him, shedding its faint patch of glimmering light. Yet there were railings, however, that puzzled him, for his stick hit the metal rods distinctly in a series. And there should be no railings round an island, yet he had most certainly crossed a dreadful open space to get where he was. His confusion and bewilderment increased with dangerous rapidity. Panic was not far away. He was no longer on an omnibus route. A rare taxi crawled past occasionally, a whitish patch at the window indicating an anxious human face. Now and again came a van or cart, the driver holding a lantern as he led the stumbling horse. These comforted him, rare though they were, but it was the figures that drew his attention most. He was quite sure they were real. They were human beings like himself. For all that, he decided he might as well be positive on the point. He tried one accordingly, a big man who rose suddenly before him out of the very earth. "Can you give me the trail to Morley Place?" he asked, but his question was drowned by the other's simultaneous inquiry in a voice much louder than his own.
"I say, is this right for the tube station? I'm utterly lost. I want South Ken."
And by the time O'Reilly had pointed the direction whence he himself had just come, the man was gone again, obliterated, swallowed up, not so much as his footsteps audible, almost as if, it seemed again, he had never been there at all. This left an acute unpleasantness in him, a sense of bewilderment greater than before. He waited 5 minutes, not daring to move a step, then tried another figure, a woman this time, who luckily knew the immediate neighborhood intimately. She gave him elaborate instructions in the kindest possible way, then vanished with incredible swiftness and ease into the sea of gloom beyond. The instantaneous way she vanished was disheartening, upsetting. It was so uncannily abrupt and sudden, yet she comforted him. Morley Place, according to her version, was not 200 yards from where he stood. He felt his way forward, step by step, using his cane, crossing a giddy open space, kicking the curb with each boot alternately, coughing and choking all the time as he did so.
"They were real, I guess, anyway," he said aloud. "They were both real, all right, and it may lift a bit soon."
He was making a great effort to hold himself in hand. He was already fighting, that is. He realized this perfectly. The only point was the reality of the figures.
"It may lift now any minute," he repeated louder.
In spite of the cold, his skin was sweating profusely. But of course it did not lift. The figures, too, became fewer. No carts were audible. He had followed the woman's directions carefully, but now found himself in some byway, evidently where pedestrians, at the best of times, were rare. There was dull silence all about him. His foot lost the curb. His cane swept the empty air, striking nothing solid. And panic rose upon him with its shuddering, icy grip. He was alone. He knew himself alone. Worse still, he was in another open space. It took him 15 minutes to cross that open space, most of the way upon his hands and knees, oblivious of the icy slime that stained his trousers, froze his fingers, intent only upon feeling solid support against his back and spine again. It was an endless period. The moment of collapse was close, the shriek already rising in his throat, the shaking of the whole body uncontrollable when his outstretched fingers struck a friendly curb and he saw a glimmering patch of diffuse radiance overhead. With a great quick effort he stood upright, and an instant later his stick rattled along an area railing. He leaned against it, breathless, panting, his heart beating painfully while the street lamp gave him the further comfort of its feeble gleam. The actual flame, however, invisible. He looked this way and that. The pavement was deserted. He was engulfed in the dark silence of the fog. But Morley Place, he knew, must be very close by now. He thought of the friendly little VAD he had known in France, of a warm, bright fire, a cup of tea and a cigarette. One more effort, he reflected, and all these would be his. He pluckily groped his way forward again, crawling slowly by the area railings. If things got really bad again, he would ring a bell and ask for help, much as he shrank from the idea. Provided he had no more open spaces to cross, provided he saw no more figures emerging and vanishing like creatures born of the fog and dwelling within it, as within their native element. It was the figures he now dreaded more than anything else, more even than the loneliness, provided the panic sense. A faint darkening of the fog beneath the next lamp caught his eye and made him start. He stopped. It was not a figure this time, it was the shadow of the pole, grotesquely magnified. No, it moved. It moved towards him. A flame of fire followed by ice flowed through him. It was a figure, close against his face. It was a woman. The doctor's advice came suddenly back to him, the counsel that had cured him of 100 phantoms. Do not ignore them. Treat them as real. Speak and go with them. You will soon prove their unreality then, and they will leave you. He made a brave, tremendous effort. He was shaking. One hand clutched the damp and icy area railing. "Lost your way like myself, haven't you, ma'am?" he said in a voice that trembled. "Do you know where we are at all? Morley Place, I'm looking for." He stopped dead. The woman moved nearer, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. Its ghastly pallor, the bright, frightened eyes that stared with a kind of dazed bewilderment into his own. The beauty, above all, arrested his speech midway. The woman was young, her tall figure wrapped in a dark fur coat. "Can I help you?" he asked impulsively, forgetting his own terror for the moment. He was more than startled. Her air of distress and pain stirred a peculiar anguish in him. For a moment she made no answer, thrusting her white face closer as if examining him. So close, indeed, that he controlled with difficulty his instinct to shrink back a little. "Where am I?" she asked at length, searching his eyes intently. "I'm lost. I've lost myself. I can't find my way back." Her voice was low, a curious wailing in it that touched his pity oddly. He felt his own distress merging in one that was greater. "Same here," he replied more confidently. "I'm terrified of being alone, too. I've had shell shock, you know. Let's go together. We'll find a way together." "Who are you?" the woman murmured, still staring at him with her big bright eyes. Their distress, however, no whit lessened. She gazed at him as though aware suddenly of his presence. He told her briefly. "And I'm going to tea with a VAD friend in Morley Place. What's your address? Do you know the name of the street?" She appeared not to hear him, or not to understand exactly. It was as if she was not listening again. "I came out so suddenly, so unexpectedly," he heard the low voice with pain in every syllable. "I can't find my home again, just when I was expecting him, too." She looked about her with a distraught expression that made O'Reilly long to carry her in his arms to safety, then and there. "He may be there now, waiting for me at this very moment, and I can't get back." And so sad was her voice that only by an effort did O'Reilly prevent himself putting out his hand to touch her. More and more he forgot himself in his desire to help her. Her beauty, the wonder of her strange bright eyes and the pallid face, made an immense appeal. He became calmer. This woman was real enough. He asked again the address, the street and number, the distance she thought it was. "Have you any idea of the direction, ma'am? Any idea at all? We'll go together and—" She suddenly cut him short. She turned her head as if to listen, so that he saw her profile a moment, the outline of the slender neck, a glimpse of jewels just below the fur. "Hark! I hear him calling. I remember." And she was gone from his side into the swirling fog. Without an instant's hesitation, O'Reilly followed her, not only because he wished to help, but because he dared not be left alone. The presence of this strange lost woman comforted him. He must not lose sight of her, whatever happened. He had to run. She went so rapidly, ever just in front, moving with confidence and certainty, turning right and left, crossing the street but never stopping, never hesitating, her companion always at her heels in breathless haste, and with a growing terror that he might lose her any minute. The way she found her direction through the dense fog was marvelous enough, but O'Reilly's only thought was to keep her in sight, lest his own panic redescend upon him with an inevitable collapse in the dark and lonely street. It was a wild and panting pursuit, and he kept her in view with difficulty, a dim fleeting outline always a few yards ahead of him. She did not once turn her head. She uttered no sound, no cry. She hurried forward with unfaltering instinct, nor did the chase occur to him once as singular. She was his safety, and that was all he realized. One thing, however, he remembered afterwards, though at the time he no more than registered the detail, paying no attention to it. A definite perfume she left upon the atmosphere, one, moreover, that he knew, although he could not find its name as he ran. It was associated vaguely for him with something unpleasant, something disagreeable. He connected it with misery and pain. It gave him a feeling of uneasiness. More than that, he did not notice at the moment, nor could he remember. He certainly did not try, where he had known this particular scent before. Then suddenly the woman stopped, opened a gate, and passed into a small private garden. So suddenly that O'Reilly, close upon her heels, only just avoided tumbling into her. "You've found it?" he cried. "May I come in a moment with you? Perhaps you'll let me telephone to the doctor." She turned instantly. Her face close against his own was livid. "Doctor," she repeated in an awful whisper. The word meant terror to her. O'Reilly stood amazed. For a second or two neither of them moved. The woman seemed petrified. "Dr. Henry, you know," he stammered, finding his tongue again. "I'm in his care. He's in Harley Street." Her face cleared as suddenly as it had darkened, though the original expression of bewilderment and pain still hung in her great eyes. But the terror left them, as though she suddenly forgot some association that had revived it. "My home," she murmured. "My home is somewhere here. I'm near it. I must get back in time. For him. I must. He's coming to me." And with these extraordinary words, she turned, walked up the narrow path and stood upon the porch of a 2-story house before her companion had recovered from his astonishment sufficiently to move or utter a syllable in reply. The front door, he saw, was ajar. It had been left open. For 5 seconds, perhaps for 10, he hesitated. It was the fear that the door would close and shut him out that brought the decision to his will and muscles. He ran up the steps and followed the woman into a dark hall where she had already preceded him, and amid whose blackness she now had finally vanished. He closed the door, not knowing exactly why he did so, and knew at once by an instinctive feeling that the house he now found himself in with this unknown woman was empty and unoccupied. In a house, however, he felt safe. It was the open streets that were his danger. He stood waiting, listening a moment before he spoke, and he heard the woman moving down the passage from door to door, repeating to herself in her low voice of unhappy wailing some words he could not understand.
"Where is it? Oh, where is it? I must get back."
O'Reilly then found himself abruptly stricken with dumbness, as though, with these strange words, a haunting terror came up and breathed against him in the darkness. Is she, after all, a figure? Ran in letters of fire across his numbed brain. Is she unreal or real? Seeking relief in action of some kind, he put out a hand automatically, feeling along the wall for an electric switch, and though he found it by some miraculous chance, no answering glow responded to the click. And the woman's voice from the darkness. Ah, at last I found it. I'm home again, at last." He heard a door open and close upstairs. He was on the ground floor now, alone. Complete silence followed. In the conflict of various emotions, fear for himself lest his panic should return, fear for the woman who had led him into this empty house and now deserted him upon some mysterious errand of her own that made him think of madness. In this conflict that held him a moment spellbound, there was a yet bigger ingredient demanding instant explanation. But an explanation that he could not find. Was the woman real or was she unreal? Was she a human being or a figure? The horror of doubt obsessed him, with an acute uneasiness that betrayed itself in a return of that unwelcome inner trembling he knew was dangerous. What saved him from a crease that must have had most dangerous results for his mind and nervous system generally seems to have been the outstanding fact that he felt more for the woman than for himself. His sympathy and pity had been deeply moved. Her voice, her beauty, her anguish and bewilderment, all uncommon, inexplicable, mysterious, formed together a claim that drove self into the background. Added to this was the detail that she had left him, gone to another floor without a word, and now behind a closed door in a room upstairs found herself face to face at last with the unknown object of her frantic search, with it, whatever it might be. Real or unreal, figure or human being, the overmastering impulse of his being was that he must go to her. It was this clear impulse that gave him decision and energy to do what he then did. He struck a match. He found a stump of candle. He made his way by means of this flickering light along the passage and up the carpetless stairs. He moved cautiously, stealthily, though not knowing why he did so. The house he now saw was indeed untenanted. Dust sheets covered the piled-up furniture. He glimpsed through doors ajar. Pictures were screened upon the walls, brackets draped to look like hooded heads. He went on slowly, steadily, moving on tiptoe as though conscious of being watched, noting the well of darkness in the hall below, the grotesque shadows that his movements cast on walls and ceiling. The silence was unpleasant, yet, remembering that the woman was expecting someone, he did not wish it broken. He reached the landing and stood still. Closed doors on both sides of a corridor met his sight, as he shaded the candle to examine the scene. Behind which of these doors, he asked himself, was the woman, figure or human being, now alone with it? There was nothing to guide him, but an instinct that he must not delay sent him forward again upon his search. He tried a door on the right, an empty room, with the furniture hidden by dust sheets and the mattress rolled up on the bed. He tried a second door, leaving the first one open behind him, and it was, similarly, an empty bedroom. Coming out into the corridor again, he stood a moment waiting, then called aloud in a low voice that yet woke echoes unpleasantly in the hall below. "Where are you? I want to help. Which room are you in?" There was no answer. He was almost glad he heard no sound, for he knew quite well that he was waiting, really, for another sound, the steps of him who was expected. And the idea of meeting with this unknown third sent a shudder through him, as though related to an interview he dreaded with his whole heart and must at all costs avoid. Waiting another moment or two, he noted that his candle stump was burning low, then crossed the landing with a feeling, at once of hesitation and determination, towards the door opposite to him. He opened it. He did not halt on the threshold. Holding the candle at arm's length, he went boldly in. And instantly his nostrils told him he was right at last, for a whiff of the strange perfume, though this time much stronger than before, greeted him, sending a new quiver along his nerves. He knew now why it was associated with unpleasantness, with pain, with misery, for he recognized it, the odor of a hospital. In this room a powerful anesthetic had been used, and recently. Simultaneously with smell, sight brought its message too. On the large double bed behind the door on his right lay, to his amazement, the woman in the dark fur coat. He saw the jewels on the slender neck, but the eyes he did not see, for they were closed. Closed, too, he grasped at once, in death. The body lay stretched at full length, quite motionless. He approached. A dark, thin streak that came from the parted lips and passed downwards over the chin, losing itself then in the fur collar, was a trickle of blood. It was hardly dry. It glistened. Strange it was, perhaps, that while imaginary fears had the power to paralyze him mind and body, the sight of something real had the effect of restoring confidence. The sight of blood and death, amid conditions often ghastly and even monstrous, was no new thing to him. He went up quietly, and with steady hand he felt the woman's cheek, the warmth of recent life still in its softness. The final cold had not yet mastered this empty form whose beauty, in its perfect stillness, had taken on a new strange sweetness of an unearthly bloom. Pallid, silent, untenanted, it lay before him, lit by the flicker of his guttering candle. He lifted the fur coat to feel for the unbeating heart. A couple of hours ago, at most, he judged, this heart was working busily. The breath came through those parted lips. The eyes were shining in full beauty. His hand encountered a hard knob, the head of a long steel hat pin driven through the heart up to its hilt. He knew then which was the figure, which was the real and which the unreal. He knew also what had been meant by it. But before he could think or reflect what action he must take, before he could straighten himself even from his bent position over the body on the bed, there sounded through the empty house below the loud clang of the front door being closed, and instantly rushed over him that other fear he had so long forgotten. Fear for himself. The panic of his own shaken nerves descended with irresistible onslaught. He turned, extinguishing the candle in the violent trembling of his hand, and tore headlong from the room. The following 10 minutes seemed a nightmare in which he was not master of himself, and knew not exactly what he did. All he realized was that steps already sounded on the stairs, coming quickly nearer. The flicker of an electric torch played on the banisters, whose shadows ran swiftly sideways along the wall as the hand that held the light ascended. He thought in a frenzied second of police, of his presence in the house, of the murdered woman. It was a sinister combination. Whatever happened, he must escape without being so much as even seen. His heart raced madly. He darted across the landing into the room opposite, whose door he had luckily left open. And by some incredible chance, apparently, he was neither seen nor heard by the man who, a moment later, reached the landing, entered the room where the body of the woman lay, and closed the door carefully behind him. Shaking, scarcely daring to breathe lest his breath be audible, O'Reilly, in the grip of his own personal terror, remnant of his uncured shock of war, had no thought of what duty might demand or not demand of him. He thought only of himself. He realized one clear issue, that he must get out of the house without being heard or seen. Who the newcomer was he did not know, beyond an uncanny assurance that it was not him whom the woman had expected, but the murderer himself, and that it was the murderer, in his turn, who was expecting this third person. In that room, with death at his elbow, a death he had himself brought about but an hour or two ago, the murderer now hid and waiting for his second victim, and the door was closed. Yet any minute it might open again, cutting off retreat. O'Reilly crept out, stole across the landing, reached the head of the stairs, and began, with the utmost caution, the perilous descent. Each time the bare boards creaked beneath his weight, no matter how stealthily this weight was adjusted, his heart missed a beat. He tested each step before he pressed upon it, distributing as much of his weight as he dared upon the banisters. It was a little more than halfway down that, to his horror, his foot caught in a projecting carpet tack. He slipped on the polished wood, and only saved himself from falling headlong by a wild clutch at the railing, making an uproar that seemed to him like the explosion of a hand grenade in the forgotten trenches. His nerves gave way then, and panic seized him. In the silence that followed the resounding echoes, he heard the bedroom door opening on the floor above. Concealment was now useless. It was impossible, too. He took the last flight of stairs in a series of leaps, 4 steps at a time, reached the hall, flew across it, and opened the front door just as his pursuer, electric torch in hand, covered half the stairs behind him. Slamming the door, he plunged headlong into the welcome, all-obscuring fog outside. The fog had now no terrors for him. He welcomed its concealing mantle. Nor did it matter in which direction he ran, so long as he put distance between him and the house of death. The pursuer had, of course, not followed him into the street. He crossed open spaces without a tremor. He ran in a circle, nevertheless, though without being aware he did so. No people were about. No single groping shadow passed him. No boom of traffic reached his ears, when he paused for breath at length against an area railing. Then for the first time he made the discovery that he had no hat. He remembered now. In examining the body, partly out of respect, partly, perhaps unconsciously, he had taken it off and laid it on the very bed. It was there, a telltale bit of damning evidence in the house of death. And a series of probable consequences flashed through his mind like lightning. It was a new hat, fortunately. More fortunate still, he had not yet written name or initials in it. But the maker's mark was there for all to read, and the police would go immediately to the shop where he had bought it only 2 days before. Would the shop people remember his appearance? Would his visit, the date, the conversation be recalled? He thought it was unlikely. He resembled dozens of men. He had no outstanding peculiarity. He tried to think, but his mind was confused and troubled. His heart was beating dreadfully. He felt desperately ill. He sought vainly for some story to account for his being out in the fog and far from home without a hat. No single idea presented itself. He clung to the icy railings, hardly able to keep upright. Collapse very near. When suddenly a figure emerged from the fog, paused a moment to stare at him, put out a hand and caught him, and then spoke. "You're ill, my dear sir," said a man's kindly voice. "Can I be of any assistance? Come, let me help you." He had seen at once that it was not a case of drunkenness. "Come, take my arm, won't you? I'm a physician. Luckily, too, you are just outside my very house. Come in." And he half dragged, half pushed O'Reilly, now bordering on collapse, up the steps and opened the door with his latchkey. "Felt ill suddenly, lost in the fog, terrified, but be all right soon, thanks awfully." The Canadian stammered his gratitude, but already feeling better. He sank into a chair in the hall while the other put down a paper parcel he had been carrying, and led him presently into a comfortable room. A fire burned brightly. The electric lamps were pleasantly shaded. A decanter of whiskey and a siphon stood on a small table beside a big armchair. And before O'Reilly could find another word to say, the other had poured him out a glass and bade him sip it slowly, without troubling to talk till he felt better. "That will revive you. Better drink it slowly. You should never have been out in a night like this. If you've far to go, better let me put you up." Very kind indeed," mumbled O'Reilly, recovering rapidly in the comfort of a presence he already liked and felt even drawn to. "No trouble at all," returned the doctor. "I've been at the front, you know. I can see what your trouble is. Shell shock, I'll be bound." The Canadian, much impressed by the other's quick diagnosis, noted also his tact and kindness. He made no reference to the absence of a hat, for instance. "Quite true," he said. "I'm with Dr. Henry in Harley Street." And he added a few words about his case. The whiskey worked its effect. He revived more and more, feeling better every minute. The other handed him a cigarette. They began to talk about his symptoms and recovery. Confidence returned in a measure, though he still felt badly frightened. The doctor's manner and personality did much to help, for there was strength and gentleness in the face, though the features showed unusual determination, softened occasionally by a sudden hint as of suffering in the bright, compelling eyes. It was the face, thought O'Reilly, of a man who had seen much, and probably been through hell, but of a man who was simple, good, sincere, yet not a man to trifle with. Behind his gentleness lay something very stern. This effect of character and personality woke the other's respect, in addition to his gratitude. His sympathy was stirred. "You encourage me to make another guess," the man was saying after a successful reading of the impromptu patient's state. "That you have had, namely, a severe shock quite recently, and—" he hesitated for the merest fraction of a second. "That it would be a relief to you," he went on, the skillful suggestion in the voice unnoticed by his companion. "It would be wise as well if you could unburden yourself to someone who would understand." He looked at O'Reilly with a kindly and very pleasant smile. "Am I not right, perhaps?" he added in a gentle voice. "Someone who would understand," repeated the Canadian. "That's my trouble exactly. You've hit it. It's all so incredible." The other smiled. "The more incredible," he suggested, "the greater your need for expression. Suppression, as you may know, is dangerous in cases like this. You think you have hidden it, but it bides its time and comes up later, causing a lot of trouble. Confession, you know," he emphasized the word, "confession is good for the soul." "You're dead right," agreed the other. "Now, if you can, bring yourself to tell it to someone who will listen and believe. To myself, for instance. I am a doctor, familiar with such things. I shall regard all you say as a professional confidence, of course. And as we are strangers, my belief or disbelief is of no particular consequence. I may tell you in advance of your story, however, I think I can promise it, that I shall believe all you have to say." O'Reilly told his story without more ado, for the suggestion of the skilled physician had found easy soil to work in. During the recital, his host's eyes never once left his own. He moved no single muscle of his body. His interest seemed intense. "A bit tall, isn't it?" said the Canadian when his tale was finished. "And the question is," he continued with a thread of volubility which the other checked instantly. "Strange, yes, but incredible, no," the doctor interrupted. "I see no reason to disbelieve a single detail of what you have just told me. Things equally remarkable, equally incredible, happen in all large towns, as I know from personal experience. I could give you instances." He paused a moment, but his companion, staring into his eyes with interest and curiosity, made no comment. "Some years ago, in fact," continued the other, "I knew of a very similar case. Strangely similar. Really, I should be immensely interested. So similar that it seems almost a coincidence. You may find it hard in your turn to credit it." He paused again while O'Reilly sat forward in his chair to listen. "Yes," pursued the doctor slowly. "I think everyone connected with it is now dead. There is no reason why I should not tell it, for one confidence deserves another, you know. It happened during the Boer War. As long ago as that," he added with emphasis. "It really is a very commonplace story in one way, though very dreadful in another. But a man who has served at the front will understand, and I'm sure will sympathize." "I'm sure of that," offered the other readily. "A colleague of mine, now dead as I mentioned, a surgeon with a big practice, married a young and charming girl. They lived happily together for several years. His wealth made her very comfortable. His consulting room, I must tell you, was some distance from his house, just as this might be, so that she was never bothered with any of his cases. Then came the war. Like many others, though much over age, he volunteered. He gave up his lucrative practice and went to South Africa. His income, of course, stopped. The big house was closed. His wife found her life of enjoyment considerably curtailed. This she considered a great hardship, it seems. She felt a bitter grievance against him. Devoid of imagination, without any power or sacrifice. A selfish type. She was yet a beautiful, attractive woman, and young. The inevitable lover came upon the scene to console her. They planned to run away together. He was rich. Japan, they thought, would suit them. Only by some ill luck, the husband got wind of it, and arrived in London just in the nick of time. Well rid of her, put in O'Reilly, I think. The doctor waited a moment. He sipped his glass. Then his eyes fixed upon his companion's face somewhat sternly. Well rid of her, yes, he continued. Only he determined to make that riddance final. He decided to kill her. And her lover, you see, he loved her. O'Reilly made no comment. In his own country, this method with a faithless woman was not unknown. His interest was very concentrated, but he was thinking, too, as he listened. Thinking hard. He planned the time and place with care, resumed the other in a lower voice, as though he might possibly be overheard. They met, he knew, in the big house now closed, the house where he and his young wife had passed such happy years during their prosperity. The plan failed, however, in an important detail. The woman came at the appointed hour, but without her lover. She found death waiting for her. It was a painless death. Then her lover, who was to arrive half an hour later, did not come at all. The door had been left open for him purposely. The house was dark, its rooms shut up, deserted. There was no caretaker even. It was a foggy night, just like this. And the other? Asked O'Reilly in a failing voice. The lover? A man did come in, the doctor went on calmly, but it was not the lover. It was a stranger. A stranger? The other whispered. And the surgeon, where was he all this time? Waiting outside to see him enter. Concealed in the fog, he saw the man go in. 5 minutes later he followed, meaning to complete his vengeance, his act of justice, whatever you like to call it. But the man who had come in was a stranger. He came in by chance, just as you might have done, to shelter from the fog, or... O'Reilly, though with a great effort, rose abruptly to his feet. He had an appalling feeling that the man facing him was mad. He had a keen desire to get outside, fog or no fog, to leave this room, to escape from the calm accents of this insistent voice. The effect of the whiskey was still in his blood. He felt no lack of confidence, but words came to him with difficulty. I think I better be pushing off now, Doctor, he said clumsily. But I feel I must thank you very much for all your kindness and help. He turned and looked hard into the keen eyes facing him. Your friend, he asked in a whisper, the surgeon, was he ever caught? No, was the grave reply, the doctor standing up in front of him. He was never caught. O'Reilly waited a moment before he made another remark. Well, he said at last, but in a louder tone than before, I think I'm glad. He went to the door without shaking hands. You have no hat, mentioned the voice behind him. If you'll wait a moment, I'll get you one of mine. You need no trouble to return it. And the doctor passed him, going into the hall. There was a sound of tearing paper. O'Reilly left the house a moment later with a hat upon his head. But it was not till he reached the tube station half an hour afterwards that he realized it was his own. End of section 13. Confession. Section 14 of The Wolves of God and Other Faith Stories by Algernon Blackwood and Wilfred Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The lane that ran east and west. 1. The curving strip of lane, fading into invisibility east and west, had always symbolized life to her. In some minds, life pictures itself a straight line, uphill, downhill, flat, as the case may be. In hers it had been, since childhood, this sweep of country lane that ran past her cottage door. In thick white summer dust, she invariably visualized it, blue and yellow flowers along its untidy banks of green. It flowed, it glided, sometimes it rushed. Without a sound it ran along past the nut trees and the branches where honeysuckle and wild roses shone. With every year now, its silent speed increased. From either end she imagined as a child that she looked over into outer space. From the eastern end into the infinity before birth, from the western into the infinity that follows death. It was to her of real importance. From the veranda the entire stretch was visible, not more than 500 yards at most. From the platform in her mind, whence she viewed existence, she saw her own life similarly, as a white curve of flowering lane, arising she knew not whence, gliding whither she could not tell. At 18 she had paraphrased the quatrain with a smile upon her red lips, her chin tilted, her strong gray eyes rather wistful with yearning. Into this little lane, and why not knowing, not whence, like water willy-nilly flowing, and out again, like dust along the waste, I know not whither, willy-nilly blowing. At 30 she now repeated it, the smile still there, but the lips not quite so red, the chin a trifle firmer, the gray eyes stronger, clearer, but charged with a more wistful and deeper yearning. It was her turn of mind, imagination, introspective, querulous perhaps, that made the bit of running lane significant. Food with the butchers' and bakers' carts came to her from its eastern, its arriving end, as she called it. News with the postman, adventure with rare callers. Youth, hope, excitement, all these came from the sunrise. Thence came likewise spring and summer, flowers, butterflies, the swallows. The fairies in her childhood had come that way too, their silver feet and gossamer wings brightening the summer dawns. And it was but a year ago that Dick Messenger, his car stirring a cloud of thick white dust, had also come into her life from the space beyond the sunrise. She sat thinking about him now, how he had suddenly appeared out of nothing that warm June morning, asked her permission about some engineering business on the neighboring big estate over the hill, giving her a dog rose and a bit of fern leaf, and eventually gone away with her promise when he left. Out of the eastern end he appeared, into the western end he vanished. From there was this departing end as well, where the lane curved out of sight into the space behind the yellow sunset. In this direction went all that left her life. Her parents, each in turn, had taken that way to the churchyard. Spring, summer, the fading butterflies, the restless swallows, all left her round that western curve. Later the fairies followed them, her dreams one by one, the vanishing years as well. And now her youth, swifter, ever swifter, into the region where the sun dipped nightly among pale rising stars, leaving her brief strip of life colder, more and more unlit. Just beyond this end, she imagined, shadows. She saw Dick's car whirling towards her, whirling away again, making for distant Mexico, where his treasure lay. In the interval he had found that treasure and realized it. He was now coming back again. He had landed in England yesterday. Seated in her deck chair on the veranda, she watched the sun sink to the level of the hazel trees. The last swallows already flashed their dark wings against the fading gold. Over that western end, tomorrow or the next day, amid a cloud of whirling white dust, would emerge, again out of nothingness, the noisy car that brought Dick Messenger back to her, back from the Mexican expedition that ensured his great new riches, back into her heart and life. In the other direction she would depart a week or so later, her life in his keeping, and his in hers, and the feet of their children, in due course, would run up and down the mysterious lane in search of flowers, butterflies, excitement, in search of life. She wondered, and as the light faded, her wondering grew deeper. Questions that had lain dormant for 12 months became audible suddenly. Would Dick be satisfied with this humble cottage, which meant so much to her that she felt she could never, never leave it? Would not his money, his new position, demand palaces everywhere? He was ambitious. Could his ambition set an altar of sacrifice to his love? And she? Could she, on the other hand, walk happy and satisfied along the western curve, leaving her lane finally behind her? Lost, untraveled, forgotten. Could she face the sacrifice for him? Was he, in a word, the man whose appearance out of the sunrise she had been watching and waiting for all these hurrying, swift years? She wondered. Now that the decisive moment was so near, unhappy doubts assailed her. Her wondering grew deeper, spread, enveloped, penetrated her like a gathering darkness. And the sun sank lower. Dusk crept along the hedgerows. The flowers closed their little burning eyes. Shadows passed hand in hand along the familiar bend that was so short, so soon traveled over, and left behind that a mistake must ruin all its sweetest joy. To wander down it with a companion to whom its flowers, its butterflies, its shadows brought no full message, must turn it chill, dark, lonely, colorless. Her thoughts slipped on thus into a soft inner reverie, born of that scented twilight hour of honeysuckle and wild roses, born too of her deep self-questioning, of wonder, of yearning unsatisfied. The lane meanwhile produced its customary few figures, moving homewards through the dusk. She knew them well, these familiar figures of the countryside, had known them from the childhood onwards. Laborers, hedgers, ditchers, and the like, with whom now, even in her reverie, she exchanged the usual friendly greetings across the wicket gate. This time, however, she gave but her mind to them, her heart absorbed with its own personal and immediate problem. Melancy had come and gone. Old Averill, carrying his hedger's sickle-knife, had followed, and she was vaguely looking for Hezekiah Purdy, bent with years and rheumatism, his tea-pail always rattling, his shuffling feet making a sorry dust, when the figure she did not quite recognize came into view, emerging unexpectedly from the sunrise end. Was it Purdy? Yes. No. Yet, if not, who was it? Of course it must be Purdy. Yet while the others, being homeward bound, came naturally from west to east, with this new figure it was otherwise, so that he was halfway down the curve before she fully realized him. Out of the eastern end, the man drew nearer. A stranger, therefore. Out of the unknown regions where the sun rose, and where no shadows were, he moved towards her down the deserted lane. Perhaps a trespasser, an intruder possibly, but certainly an unfamiliar figure. Without particular attention or interest, she watched him drift nearer down her little semi-private lane of dream, passing leisurely from east to west. The mere fact that he was there, establishing an intimacy that remained at first unsuspected. It was her eye that watched him, not her mind. What was he doing here? Where going? Whither come? She wondered vaguely. The lane both his background and his starting point. A little byway, after all, this haunted lane. The real world, she knew, swept down the big high road beyond, unconscious of the humble folk its unimportant tributaries served. Suddenly the burden of the years assailed her. Had she then missed life by living here? Then, with a little shock, her heart contracted, as she became aware of two eyes fixed upon her in the dusk. The stranger had already reached the wicket gate, and now stood leaning against it, staring at her over its spiked wooden top. It was certainly not old Purdy. The blood rushed back into her heart again as she returned the gaze. He was watching her with a curious intentness, with an odd sense of authority almost, with something that persuaded her instantly of a definite purpose in his being there. He was waiting for her, expecting her to come down and speak with him, as she had spoken with the others. Of this, her little habit, he made use, she felt. Shyly, half nervously, she left her deck chair and went slowly down the short gravel path between the flowers, noticing meanwhile that his clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, his face worn and ravaged as by want and suffering, yet that his eyes were curiously young. His eyes indeed were full brown, smiling eyes, and it was the surprise of his youth that impressed her chiefly. That he could be tramp or trespasser left her. She felt no fear. She wished him good evening in her calm, quiet voice, adding with sympathy, "And who are you, I wonder? You want to ask me something?" It flashed across her that his shabby clothing was somehow a disguise. Over his shoulder hung a faded sack. "I can do something for you?" she pursued inquiringly, as was her kindly custom. "If you are hungry, thirsty, or—" It was the expression of vigor leaping into the deep eyes that stopped her. "If you need clothes," she had been going to add. She was not frightened, but suddenly she paused, gripped by a wonder she could not understand. And his first words justified her wonder. "I have something for you," he said, his voice faint, a kind of stillness in it as though it came through distance. Also, though this she did not notice, it was an educated voice, and it was the absence of surprise that made this detail too natural to claim attention. She had expected it. "Something to give you. I have brought it for you," the man concluded. "Yes," she replied, aware, again, without comprehension, that her courage and her patience were both summoned to support her. "Yes," she repeated more faintly, as though this was all natural, inevitable, expected. She saw that the sack was now lifted from his shoulder, and that his hand plunged into it, as it hung apparently loose and empty against the gate. His eyes, however, never for one instant left her own. Alarm, she was able to remind herself, she did not feel. She only recognized that this ragged figure laid something upon her spirit she could not fathom, yet was compelled to face. His next words startled her. She drew, if unconsciously, upon her courage. "A dream?" The voice was deep, yet still with the faintness as of distance in it. His hand, she saw, was moving slowly from the empty sack. A strange attraction mingled with pity, with yearning, too, stirred deeply in her. The face, it seemed, turned soft. The eyes glowed with some inner fire of feeling. Her heart now beat unevenly. "Something to sell to me?" she faltered, aware that his glowing eyes upon her made her tremble. The same instant she was ashamed of the words, knowing they were uttered by a portion of her that resisted, and this was not the language he deserved. He smiled, and she knew that her resistance was a vain make-believe he pierced too easily, though he let it pass in silence. "There is, a price for every dream," she tried to save herself, conscious delightfully that her heart was smiling in return. The dusk enveloped them. The corncrakes were calling from the fields. The scent of honeysuckle and wild roses lay round her in a warm wave of air. Yet at the same time she felt as if her naked soul stood side by side with this figure in the infinitude of space beyond the sunrise end. The golden stars hung calm and motionless above them. "That price," his answer felt like a summons she had actually expected. "You pay to another, not to me." The voice grew fainter, farther away, dropping through empty space behind her. "All dreams are but a single dream. You pay that price to—" Her interruption slipped spontaneously from her lips, its inevitable truth a prophecy. "To myself." He smiled again, but this time he did not answer. His hand, instead, now moved across the gate towards her, and before she quite realized what had happened, she was holding a little object he had passed across to her. She had taken it, obeying, it seemed, an inner compulsion and authority which were inevitable, foreordained. Lowering her face, she examined it in the dusk, a small green leaf of fern, fingered it with tender caution as it lay in her palm, gazed for some seconds closely at the tiny thing. When she looked up again, the stranger, the seller of dreams as she now imagined him, had moved some yards away from the gate and was moving still, a leisurely quiet tread that stirred no dust, a shadowy outline soft with dusk and starlight, moving towards the sunrise end, whence he had first appeared. Her heart gave a sudden leap, as once again the burden of the years assailed her. Her words seemed driven out. "Who are you? Before you go, your name, what is your name?" His voice, now faint with distance as he melted from sight against the dark fringe of hazel trees, reached her but indistinctly, though its meaning was somehow clear. "The dream," she heard like a breath of wind against her ear, "shall bring its own name with it. I wait." Both sound and figure trailed off into the unknown space beyond the eastern end, and, leaning against the wicket gate as usual, the white dust settling about his heavy boots. The tea-pail but just ceased from rattling was old Purdy. Unless the mind can fix the reality of an event in the actual instant of its happening, judgment soon dwindles into a confusion between memory and argument. 5 minutes later, when old Purdy had gone his way again, she found herself already wondering, reflecting, questioning. Yearning had perhaps conjured with emotion to fashion both voice and figure out of imagination, out of this perfumed dusk, out of the troubled heart's desire. Confusion in time had further helped to metamorphose old Purdy into some legendary shape that had stolen upon her mood of reverie from the shadows of her beloved lane. Yet the dream she had accepted from a stranger hand, a little fern leaf, remained at any rate to shape a delightful certainty her brain might criticize while her heart believed. The fern leaf assuredly was real. A fairy gift. Those who eat of this fern seed, she remembered as she sank into sleep that night, shall see the fairies. And indeed, a few hours later she walked in dream along the familiar curve between the hedges, her own childhood taking her by the hand as she played with the flowers, the butterflies, the glad swallows beckoning while they flashed. Without the smallest sense of surprise or unexpectedness, too, she met at the eastern end 2 figures. They stood, as she with her childhood stood, hand in hand, the seller of dreams and her lover, waiting since time began. She realized, waiting with some great unuttered question on their lips. Neither addressed her, neither spoke a word. Dick looked at her, ambition, hard and restless, shining in his eyes. In the eyes of the other, dark, gentle, piercing, but extraordinarily young for all the ragged hair about the face, the shabby clothes, the ravaged and unkempt appearance, a brightness as of the coming dawn. A choice, she understood, was offered to her. There was a decision she must make. She realized, as though some great wind blew it into her from outer space, another new standard to which her judgment must inevitably conform, or admit the purpose of her life evaded finally. The same moment she knew what her decision was. No hesitation touched her. Calm, yet trembling, her courage and her patience faced the decision and accepted it. The hands then instantly fell apart, unclasped. One figure turned and vanished down the lane towards the departing end, but with the other, now hand in hand, she rose, floating, gliding without effort, a strange bliss in her heart, to meet the sunrise. "He has awakened, so he cannot stay," she heard, like a breath of wind that whispered into her ear. "I, who bring you this dream, I wait." She did not wake at once when the dream was ended, but slept on long beyond her accustomed hour, missing thereby Melancy, Averill, old Purdy, as they passed the wicket gate in the early hours. She woke, however, with a new clear knowledge of herself, of her mind and heart, to all of which in simple truth to her own soul she must conform. The fern seed she placed in a locket attached to a fine gold chain about her neck. During the long, lonely, expectant, yet unsatisfied years that followed, she wore it day and night. 2. She had the curious feeling that she remained young. Others grew older, but not she. She watched her contemporaries slowly give the signs, while she herself held stationary. Even those younger than herself went past her, growing older in the ordinary way, whereas her heart, her mind, even her appearance, she felt certain hardly aged at all. In a room full of people, she felt pity often as she read the signs in their faces, knowing her own unchanged. Their eyes were burning out, but hers burned on. It was neither vanity nor delusion, but an inner conviction she could not alter. The age she held to was the year she had received the fern seed from old Purdy, or rather from an imaginary figure her reverie had set momentarily in old Purdy's place. That figure of her reverie, the dream that followed, the subsequent confession to Dick Messenger, meeting his own halfway, these marked the year when she stopped growing older. To that year she seemed chained, gazing into the sunrise end, waiting, ever waiting. Whether in her absent-minded reverie she had actually plucked the bit of fern herself, or whether After all, old Purdy had handed it to her, was not a point that troubled her. It was in her locket about her neck, still, day and night. The Cellar of Dreams was an established, imaginative reality in her life. Her heart assured her that she would meet him again one day. She waited. It was very curious. It was rather pathetic. Men came and went. She saw her chances pass. Her answer was invariably no. The break came suddenly and with devastating effect. As she was dressing carefully for the party, full of excited anticipation, like some young girl still, she saw, looking out upon her from the long mirror, a face of plain middle age. A blackness rose about her. It seemed the mirror shattered. The long, long dream, at any rate, fell in 1,000 broken pieces at her feet. It was perhaps the ball dress, perhaps the flowers in her hair. It may have been the low-cut gown that betrayed the neck and throat, or the one brilliant jewel that proved her eyes now dimmed beside it. But most probably it was the telltale hands, whose aging no artifice can ever conceal. The middle-aged woman, at any rate, rushed from the glass and claimed her. It was a long time, too, before the signs of tears had been carefully obliterated again, and the battle with herself, to go or not to go, was decided by clear courage. She would not send a hurried excuse of illness, but would take the place where she now belonged. She saw herself, a fading figure, more than halfway now towards the sunset end, within sight even of the shadowed emptiness that lay beyond the sun's dipping edge. She had lingered overlong, expecting a dream to confirm a dream. She had been oblivious of the truth that the lane went rushing just the same. It was now too late. The speed increased. She had waited for nothing. The Cellar of Dreams was a myth. No man could need her as she now was. Yet the chief ingredient in her decision was, oddly enough, itself a sign of youth. A party, a ball, is ever an adventure. Fate, with her destined eyes aglow, may be bidden too, waiting among the throng, waiting for that very one who hesitates, whether to go or not to go. Who knows what the evening may bring forth? It was this anticipation, faintly beckoning, its voice the mere echo of her shadowy youth, that tipped the scales between an evening of sleepless regrets at home and hours of neglected loneliness, watching the young fulfill the happy night. This and her courage weighed the balance down against the afflicting weariness of her sudden disillusion. Therefore she went, her aunt, in whose house she was a visitor, accompanying her. They arrived late, walking under the awning alone into the great mansion. Music, flowers, lovely dresses, and bright happy faces filled the air about them. The dancing feet, the flashing eyes, the swinging of the music, the throng of graceful figures expressed one word: pleasure. Pleasure, of course, meant youth. Beneath the calm summer stars, youth realized itself prodigally, reckless of years to follow. Under the same calm stars, some 50 miles away in Kent, her stretch of deserted lane flowed peacefully, never pausing, passing relentlessly out into unknown space beyond the edge of the world. A girl and a middle-aged woman bravely watched both scenes. "Dreadfully overcrowded," remarked her prosaic aunt. "When I was a young thing, there was more taste. Always room to dance, at any rate." "It is a rabble, rather," replied the middle-aged woman, while the girl added, "but I enjoy it." She had enjoyed one duty dance with an elderly man, to whom her aunt had introduced her. She now sat watching the rabble whirl and laugh. Her friend, behind unabashed lorgnettes, made occasional comments. "There's Mabel. Look at her frock, will you? The naked back. The way he holds her, too." She looked at Mabel Messenger, exactly her own age, wife of the successful engineer, yet bearing herself almost like a girl. "He's away in Mexico, as usual," went on her aunt, "with somebody else, also as usual." "I don't envy her," mentioned the middle-aged woman, while the girl added, "But she did well for herself anyhow." "It's a mistake to wait too long," was a suggestion she did not comment on. The host's brother came up and carried off her aunt. She was left alone. An old gentleman dropped into the vacated chair. Only in the center of the brilliantly lit room was there dancing now. People stood and talked in animated throngs. Every seat along the walls, every chair and sofa, and alcove corners occupied. The landing outside the great flung doors was packed. Some, going on elsewhere, were already leaving, but others, arriving late, still poured up the staircase. Her loneliness remained unnoticed. With many other women, similarly stationed behind the whirling, moving dancers, she sat looking on, an artificial smile of enjoyment upon her face, but the eyes empty and unlit. 2 pictures she watched simultaneously, the gay ballroom and the lane that ran east and west. Midnight was past and supper over, though she had not noticed it. Her aunt had disappeared finally, it seemed. The 2 pictures filled her mind, absorbed her. What she was feeling was not clear, for there was confusion in her between the 2 scenes somewhere, as though the brilliant ballroom lay set against the dark background of the lane beneath the quiet stars. The contrast struck her. How calm and lovely the night lane seemed against this feverish gaiety, this heat, this artificial perfume, these exaggerated clothes. Like a small, rapid cinema picture, the dazzling ballroom passed along the dark throat of the deserted lane. A patch of light, alive with whirling animalculae. It shone a moment against the velvet background of the midnight countryside. It grew smaller and smaller. It vanished over the edge of the departing end. It was gone. Night and the stars enveloped her, and her eyes became accustomed to the change so that she saw the sandy strip of lane, the hazel bushes, the dim outline of the cottage. Her naked soul, it seemed again, stood facing an infinitude. Yet the scent of roses, of dew-soaked grass came to her. A blackbird was whistling in the hedge. The eastern end showed itself now more plainly. The tops of the trees defined themselves. There came a glimmer in the sky. An early swallow flashed past against a streak of pale sweet gold. Old Purdy, his tea-pail faintly rattling, a stir of thick white dust about his feet, came slowly round the curve. It was the sunrise. A deep, passionate thrill ran through her body from head to feet. There was a clap beside her. In the air it seemed as though the wings of the early swallow had flashed past her very ear, or the approaching sunrise called aloud. She turned her head, along the brightening lane, but also across the gay ballroom. Old Purdy, straightening up his bent shoulders, was gazing over the wicket gate into her eyes. Something quivered. A shimmer ran fluttering before her sight. She trembled. Over the crowd of intervening heads, as over the spiked top of the little gate, a man was gazing at her. Old Purdy, however, did not fade, nor did his outline wholly pass. There was this confusion between 2 pictures, yet this man who gazed at her was in the London ballroom. He was so tall and straight. The same moment her aunt's face appeared below his shoulder, only just visible, and he turned his head, but did not turn his eyes, to listen to her. Both looked her way. They moved, threading their way towards her. It meant an introduction coming. He had asked for it. She did not catch his name, so quickly, yet so easily and naturally the little formalities were managed, and she was dancing. The same sweet, dim confusion was about her. His touch, his voice, his eyes combined extraordinarily in a sense of complete possession to which she yielded utterly. The 2 pictures, moreover, still held their place. Behind the glaring lights ran the pale sweet gold of a country dawn. Woven like a silver thread among the strings, she heard the blackbirds whistling. In the stale, heated air lay the subtle freshness of a summer sunrise. Their dancing feet bore them along in a flowing motion that curved from east to west. They danced without speaking. One rhythm took them. Like a single person, they glided over the smooth, perfect floor. And more to her, it was as if the floor flowed with them, bearing them along. Such dancing she had never known. The strange sweetness of the confusion that half entranced her increased, almost as though she lay upon her partner's arms, and that he bore her through the air. Both the sense of weight and the touch of her feet on solid ground were gone delightfully. The London room grew hazy too. The other figures faded. The ceiling, half-transparent, let through a filtering glimmer of the dawn. Her thoughts, surely he shared them with her, went out floating beneath this brightening sky. There was a sound of wakening birds, a smell of flowers. They had danced perhaps 5 minutes when both stopped abruptly as with one accord. "Shall we sit it out, if you've no objection?" he suggested in the very instant that the same thought occurred to her. "The conservatory, among the flowers," he added, leading her to the corner among scented blooms and plants, exactly as she herself desired. There were leaves and ferns about them in the warm air. The light was dim, a streak of gold in the sky showed through the glass. But for one other couple, they were alone. "I have something to say to you," he began. "You must have thought it curious. I've been staring at you so. The whole evening I've been watching you." "I hadn't noticed," she said truthfully, her voice, as it were, not quite her own. "I've not been dancing. Only once, that is." But her heart was dancing as she said it. For the first time she became aware of her partner more distinctly. Of his deep, resonant voice, his soldierly, tall figure, his deferential, almost protective manner. She turned suddenly and looked into his face. The clear, rather penetrating eyes reminded her of someone she had known. At the same instant he used her thought, turning it in his own direction. "I can't remember for the life of me," he said quietly, "where I have seen you before. Your face is familiar to me. Oddly familiar. Years ago, in my first youth somewhere." It was as though he broke something to her gently. Something he was sure of, and knew positively, that yet might shock and startle her. The blood rushed from her heart as she quickly turned her gaze away. The wave of deep feeling that rose with a sensation of glowing warmth troubled her voice. "I find in you, too, a faint resemblance to someone I have met," she murmured. Without meaning it, she let slip the added words, "when I was a girl." She felt him start, but he saved the situation, making it ordinary again, by obtaining her permission to smoke, then slowly lighting his cigarette before he spoke. "You must forgive me," he put in with a smile. "But your name, when you were kind enough to let me be introduced, escaped me. I did not catch it." She told him her surname, but he added in his persuasive yet somehow masterful way for the Christian name as well. He turned round instantly as she gave it, staring hard at her with meaning, with an examining intentness, with open curiosity. There was a question on his lips, but she interrupted, delaying it by a question of her own. Without looking at him, she knew and feared his question. Her voice just concealed a trembling that was in her throat. "My aunt," she agreed lightly, "is incorrigible. Do you know I didn't catch yours either? Oh, I meant your surname," she added, confusion gaining upon her when he mentioned his first name only. He became suddenly more earnest. His voice deepened. His whole manner took on the guise of deliberate intention, backed by some profound emotion that he could no longer hide. The music, which had momentarily ceased, began again, and a couple, who had been sitting out diagonally across from them, rose and went out. They were now quite alone. The sky was brighter. "I must tell you," he went on in a way that compelled her to look up and meet his intent gaze. "You really must allow me. I feel sure somehow you'll understand. At any rate," he added, like a boy, "you won't laugh." She believes she gave the permission and assurance. Memory fails her a little here, for as she returned his gaze it seemed a curious change came stealing over him. Yet at first so imperceptibly, so vaguely that she could not say when it began, nor how it happened. "Yes," she murmured. "Please." The change defined itself. She stopped dead. "I know now where I've seen you before. I remember." His voice vibrated like a wind in big trees. It enveloped her. "Yes," she repeated in a whisper, for the hammering of her heart made both a louder tone or further words impossible. She knew not what he was going to say, yet at the same time she knew with accuracy. Her eyes gazed helplessly into his. The change absorbed her. Within his outline she watched another outline grow. Behind the immaculate evening clothes a ragged, unkempt figure rose, a worn, ravaged face, with young, burning eyes peered through his own. "Please, please," she whispered again very faintly. He took her hand in his. His voice came from very far away, yet drawing nearer, and the scene about them faded, vanished. The lane that curved east and west now stretched behind him. and she sat gazing towards the sunrise end, as years ago when the girl passed into the woman first. "I knew a friend of yours, Dick Messenger," he was saying in this distant voice that was yet close beside her. "Knew him at school, at Cambridge, and later in Mexico. We worked in the same mines together, only he was contractor and I was in difficulties. That made no difference. He told me about a girl, of his love and admiration, an admiration that remained, but a love that had already faded." She saw only the ragged outline within the well-groomed figure of the man who spoke. The young eyes that gazed so piercingly into hers belonged to him, the seller of her dream of years before. It was to this ragged stranger in her lane she made her answer. "I, too, now remember," she said softly. "Please, go on." "He gave me his confidence, asking me where his duty lay, and I told him that the real love comes once only. It knows no doubt, no fading. I told him this." "We both discovered it in time," she said to herself, so low it was scarcely audible, yet not resisting as he laid his other hand upon the one he already held. "I also told him there was only one true dream," the voice continued, the inner face drawing nearer to the outer that contained it. "I asked him, and he told me everything. I knew all about this girl. Her picture, too, he showed me." The voice broke off. The flood of love and pity, of sympathy and understanding that rose in her like a power long suppressed, threatened tears, yet happy, yearning tears like those of a girl which only the quick, strong pressure of his hands prevented. "The little painting, yes, I know it," she faltered. "It saved me," he said simply. "It changed my life. From that moment I began living decently again, living for an ideal." Without knowing that she did so, the pressure of her hand upon his own came instantly. He gave it to me," the voice went on, "to keep. He said he could neither keep it himself nor destroy it. It was the day before he sailed. I remember it as yesterday. I said I must give him something in return, or it would cut friendship. But I had nothing in the world to give. We were in the hills. I picked a leaf of fern instead. 'Fern seed,' I told him. 'It will make you see the fairies and find your true dream.' I remember his laugh to this day, a sad, uneasy laugh. 'I shall give it to her,' he told me, 'when I give her my difficult explanation.' But I said, 'Give it with my love and tell her that I wait.' He looked at me with surprise, incredulous. Then he said slowly, 'Why not, if only you hadn't let yourself go to pieces like this?' An immensity of clear emotion she could not understand passed over her in a wave. Involuntarily she moved closer against him with her eyes unflinchingly upon his own. She whispered, 'You were hungry, thirsty. You had no clothes. You waited.' 'You're reading my thoughts as I knew one day you would.' It seemed as if their minds, their bodies too, were one, as he said the words. 'You too. You waited.' His voice was low. There came a glow between them as of hidden fire. Their faces shone. There was a brightening as of dawn upon their skins, within their eyes, lighting their very hair. Out of this happy sky his voice floated to her, with the blackbird's song. 'And that night I dreamed of you. I dreamed I met you in an English country lane.' 'We did,' she murmured, as though it were quite natural. 'I dreamed I gave you the fern leaf, across a wicket gate, and in front of a little house that was our home. In my dream I handed to you a dream.' 'You did.' And as she whispered it, the two figures merged into one before her very eyes. 'See,' she added softly, 'I have it still. It is in my locket at this moment, for I have worn it day and night through all these years of waiting.' She began fumbling at her chain. He smiled. 'Such things,' he said gently, 'are beyond me, rather. I have found you. That's all that matters. That,' he smiled again, 'is real at any rate.' 'A vision,' she murmured, half to herself and half to him. 'I can understand. A dream, though wonderful, is a dream, but the little fern you gave me,' drawing the fine gold chain from her bosom, 'the actual leaf I have worn all these years in my locket." He smiled as she held the locket out to him, her fingers feeling for the little spring. He shook his head, but so slightly she did not notice it. "I will prove it to you," she said. "I must. Look!" she cried as with trembling hands she pressed the hidden catch. "There! There!" With heads held close together, they bent over. The tiny lid flew open, and as he took her for one quick instant in his arms, the sun flashed his first golden shaft upon them, covering them with light. But her exclamation of incredulous surprise he smothered with a kiss. For inside the little locket there lay nothing. It was quite empty. End of section 14. The Lane That Ran East and West. Section 15 of The Wolves of God and Other Face Stories by Algernon Blackwood and Wilfred Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Vengeance is Mine. Chapter 1. An active, vigorous man in holy orders, yet compelled by heart trouble to resign a living in Kent before full middle age, he had found suitable work with the Red Cross in France, and it rather pleased a strain of innocent vanity in him that Rouen, whence he derived his Norman blood, should be the scene of his activities. He was a gentle-minded soul, a man deeply read and thoughtful, but goodness perhaps his outstanding quality, believing no evil of others. He had been slow, for instance, at first to credit the German atrocities, until the evidence had compelled him to face the appalling facts. With acceptance, then, he had experienced a revulsion, which other gentle minds have probably also experienced, a burning desire, namely, that the perpetrators should be fitly punished. This primitive instinct of revenge, he called it a lust, he sternly repressed. It involved a descent to lower levels of conduct irreconcilable with the progress of the race he so passionately believed in. Revenge pertained to savage days, but though he hid away the instinct in his heart, afraid of its clamor and persistency, it revived from time to time as fresh horrors made it bleed anew. It remained alive, unsatisfied, while with its analysis his mind strove unconsciously. That an intellectual nation should deliberately include frightfulness as a chief item in its creed perplexed him horribly. It seemed to him conscious, spiritual evil openly affirmed. Some genuine worship of Odin, Wotan, Moloch lay still embedded in the German outlook, and beneath the veneer of their pretentious culture. He often wondered, too, what effect the recognition of these horrors must have upon gentle minds and other men, and especially upon imaginative minds. How did they deal with the fact that this appalling thing existed in human nature in the 20th century? Its survival, indeed, caused his belief in civilization as a whole to waver. Was progress, his pet ideal and cherished faith, after all a mockery? Had human nature not advanced? His work in the great hospitals and convalescent camps beyond the town was tiring. He found little time for recreation, much less for rest. A light dinner and bed by 10 o'clock was the usual way of spending his evenings. He had no social intercourse, for everyone else was as busy as himself. The enforced solitude, not quite wholesome, was unavoidable. He found no outlet for his thoughts. First-hand acquaintance with suffering, physical and mental, was no new thing to him. But this close familiarity, day by day, with maimed and broken humanity, preyed considerably on his mind, while the fortitude and cheerfulness shown by the victims deepened the impression of respectful, yearning wonder made upon him. They were so young, so fine and careless, these lads whom the German lust for power had robbed of limbs and eyes, of mind, of life itself. The sense of horror grew in him with cumulative but unrelieved effect. With the lengthening of the days in February, and especially when March saw the welcome change to summertime, the natural desire for open air asserted itself, instead of retiring early to his dingy bedroom. He would stroll out after dinner through the ancient streets. When the air was not too chilly, he would prolong these outings, starting at sunset and coming home beneath the bright, mysterious stars. He knew at length every turn and winding of the old-world alleys, every gable, every tower and spire, from the Vieux Marché, where Joan of Arc was burnt, to the busy quays, thronged now with soldiers from half a dozen countries. He wandered on past gray gateways of crumbling stone that marked the former banks of the old tidal river. An English army 5 centuries ago had camped here among reeds and swamps, besieging the Norman capital, where now they brought in supplies of men and material upon modern docks. A mighty invasion of a very different kind. Imaginative reflection was his constant mood. But it was the haunted streets that touched him most, stirring some chord his ancestry had planted in him. The forest of spires thronged the air with strange stone flowers, silvered by moonlight as though white fire streamed from branch and petal. The old church towers soared. The cathedral touched the stars. After dark, the modern note, paramount in the daylight, seemed hushed. With sunset, it underwent a definite night change. Although the darkened streets kept alive in him the menace of fire and death, the crowding soldiers, dipped to the face in shadow, seemed somehow negligible. The leaning roofs and gables hid them in a purple sea of mist that blurred their modern garb, steel weapons and the like. Shadows themselves, they entered the being of the town. Their feet moved silently. There was a hush and murmur. The brooding buildings absorbed them easily. Ancient and modern, that is, unable successfully to mingle, let fall grotesque, incongruous shadows on his thoughts, the spirit of medieval days stole over him, exercising its inevitable sway upon a temperament already predisposed to welcome it. Witchcraft and wonder, pagan superstition and speculation, combined with an ancestral tendency to weave a spell, half of acceptance, half of shrinking, about his imaginative soul in which poetry and logic seemed otherwise fairly balanced. Too wary for critical judgment to discern clear outlines, his mind, during these magical twilight walks, became the playground of opposing forces, some power of dreaming, it seems, too easily in the ascendant. The soul of ancient ruin, stealing beside his footsteps in the dusk, put forth a shadowy hand and touched him. The shadowy spell he denied as far as in him lay, though the resistance offered by reason to instinct lacked true driving power. The dice were loaded otherwise in such a soul. His own blood harked back unconsciously to the days when men were tortured, broken on the wheel, walled up alive, and burnt for small offenses. This shadowy hand stirred faint ancestral memories in him, part instinct, part desire. The next step, by which he saw a similar attitude flowering full-blown in the German frightfulness, was too easily made to be rejected. The German horrors made him believe that this ignorant cruelty of olden days threatened the world now in a modern organized shape that proved its survival in the human heart. Shuddering, he fought against the natural desire for adequate punishment, but forgot that repressed emotions sooner or later must assert themselves. Essentially irrepressible, they may force an outlet in distorted fashion. He hardly recognized perhaps their actual claim, yet it was audible occasionally. For, owing to his loneliness, the natural outlet, in talk and intercourse, was denied. Then, with the softer winds, he yearned for country air. The sweet spring days had come. Morning and evening were divine. Above the town, the orchards were in bloom. Birds blew their tiny bugles on the hills. The midday sun began to burn. It was the time of the final violence, when the German hordes flung like driven cattle against the western line where free men fought for liberty. Fate hovered dreadfully in the balance that spring of 1918. Amiens was threatened, and if Amiens fell, Rouen must be evacuated. The town, already full, became now overfull. On his way home one evening he passed the station, crowded with homeless new arrivals. "Got the wind up, it seems, in Amiens," cried a cheery voice, as an officer he knew went by him hurriedly, and as he heard it, the mood of the spring became of a sudden uppermost. He reached a decision. The German horror came abruptly closer. This further overcrowding of the narrow streets was more than he could face. It was a small personal decision merely, but he must get out among woods and fields, among flowers and wholesome growing things, taste simple, innocent life again. The following evening he would pack his haversack with food and tramp the 4 miles to the great Forêt Verte, delicious name, and spend the night with trees and stars, breathing his full of sweetness. Calm and peace. He was too accustomed to the thunder of the guns to be disturbed by it. The song of a thrush, the whistle of a blackbird, would easily drown that. He made his plan accordingly. The next 2 nights, however, a warm, soft rain was falling. Only on the 3rd evening could he put his little plan into execution. Anticipatory enjoyment, meanwhile, lightened his heart. He did his daily work more competently. The spell of the ancient city weakened somewhat. The shadowy hand withdrew. 2. Meanwhile, a curious adventure intervened. His good and simple heart, disciplined these many years in the way a man should walk, received upon its imaginative side a stimulus that in his case amounted to a shock. That a strange and comely woman should make eyes at him disturbed his equilibrium considerably. That he should enjoy the attack, though without at first responding openly, even without full comprehension of its meaning, disturbed it even more. It was, moreover, no ordinary attack. He saw her first the night after his decision, when, in a mood of disappointment due to the rain, he came down to his lonely dinner. The room, he saw, was crowded with new arrivals, from Amiens, doubtless, where they had the wind up. The wealthier civilians had fled for safety to Rouen. These interested and, in a measure, stimulated him. He looked at them sympathetically, wondering what dear home life they had so hurriedly relinquished at the near thunder of the enemy guns, and in doing so, he noticed, sitting alone at a small table just in front of his own, yet with her back to him, a woman. She drew his attention instantly. The first glance told him that she was young and well-to-do, the second that she was unusual. What precisely made her unusual he could not say, although he at once began to study her intently. Dignity, atmosphere, personality, he perceived beyond all question. She sat there with an air. The becoming little hat with its challenging feather slightly tilted, the set of the shoulders, the neat waist and slender outline. Possibly, too, the hair about the neck, and the faint perfume that was wafted towards him as the serving girl swept past, combined in the persuasion. Yet he felt it as more than a persuasion. She attracted him with a subtle vehemence he had never felt before. The instant he set eyes upon her, his blood ran faster. The thought rose passionately in him, almost the words that phrased it. I wish I knew her. The sudden flash of response his whole being certainly gave to the back of an unknown woman. It was both vehement and instinctive. He lay stress upon its instinctive character. He was aware of it before reason told him why. That it was in response, he also noted, for although he had not seen her face and she assuredly had made no sign, he again felt that attraction which involves also invitation. So vehement, moreover, was this response in him that he felt shy and ashamed the same instant, for it almost seemed he had expressed his thought in audible words. He flushed, and the flush ran through his body. He was conscious of heated blood, as in a youth of 25. And when a man past 40 knows this touch of fever, he may also know, though he may not recognize it, that the danger signal which means possible abandon has been lit. Moreover, as though to prove his instinct justified, it was at this very instant that the woman turned and stared at him deliberately. She looked into his eyes, and he looked into hers. He knew a moment's keen distress, a sharpest possible discomfort. That, after all, he had expressed his desire audibly. Yet though he blushed, he did not lower his eyes. The embarrassment passed instantly, replaced by a thrill of strangest pleasure and satisfaction. He knew a tinge of inexplicable dismay as well. He felt for a second helpless before what seemed a challenge in her eyes. The eyes were too compelling. They mastered him. In order to meet his gaze, she had made a full turn in her chair, for her table was placed directly in front of his own. She did so without concealment. It was no mere attempt to see what lay behind making a half-turn and pretending to look elsewhere. No corner-of-the-eye business, but a full, straight, direct, significant stare. She looked into his soul as though she called him. He looked into hers as though he answered, sitting there like a statue, motionless, without a bow, without a smile. He returned her intense regard unflinchingly, and yet unwillingly. He made no sign. He shivered again. It was perhaps 10 seconds before she turned away with an air as if she had delivered her message and received his answer. But in those 10 seconds, a series of singular ideas crowded his mind, leaving an impression that 10 years could never efface. The face and eyes produced a kind of intoxication in him. There was almost recognition, as though she said, "Ah, there you are. I was waiting. You'll have to come, of course. You must." And just before she turned away, she smiled. He felt confused and helpless. The face he described as unusual, familiar too, as with the atmosphere of some long-forgotten dream, and if beauty perhaps was absent, character and individuality were supreme. Implacable resolution was stamped upon the features, which yet were sweet and womanly, stirring an emotion in him that he could not name and certainly did not recognize. The eyes, slanting a little upwards, were full of fire, the mouth voluptuous but very firm, the chin and jaw most delicately modeled, yet with a masculine strength that told of inflexible resolve. The resolution, as a whole, was the most relentless he had ever seen upon a human countenance. It dominated him. How vain to resist the will, he thought, that lies behind. He was conscious of enslavement. She conveyed a message that he must obey, admitting compliance with her unknown purpose. That some extraordinary wordless exchange was registered thus between them seemed very clear, and it was just at this moment, as if to signify her satisfaction, that she smiled. At his feeling of willing compliance with some purpose in her mind, the smile appeared. It was faint, so faint indeed that the eyes betrayed it, rather than the mouth and lips. But it was there. He saw it, and he thrilled again to this added touch of wonder and enchantment. Yet, strangest of all, he maintains that with the smile there fluttered over the resolute face a sudden arresting tenderness, as though some wild flower lit a granite surface with its melting loveliness. He was aware in the clear, strong eyes of unshed tears, of sympathy, of self-sacrifice he called maternal, of clinging love. It was this tenderness, as of a soft and gracious mother, and this implacable resolution, as of a stern, relentless man, that left upon his receptive soul the strange impression of sweetness, yet of domination. The brief 10 seconds were over. She turned away as deliberately as she had turned to look. He found himself trembling with confused emotions he could not disentangle, could not even name. For with the subtle intoxication of compliance in his soul lay also a vigorous protest that included refusal, even a violent refusal given with horror. This unknown woman, without actual speech or definite gesture, had lit a flame in him that linked on far away and out of sight with the magic of the ancient city's medieval spell. Both, he decided, were undesirable, both to be resisted. He found himself equally decided, too, upon another thing which, in spite of his momentary confusion, stood out clearly. The magic of the city, the enchantment of the woman, both attacked a constitutional weakness in his blood, a line of least resistance. It wore no physical aspect, breathed no hint of ordinary romance. The mere male and female, moral or immoral touch was wholly absent. Yet passion lurked there. Tumultuous, if hidden, and attractive consciousness, long traveled, was lit by sudden ominous flares. His character, his temperament, his calling in life as a former clergyman, and now a Red Cross worker, being what they were, he stood on the brink of an adventure not dangerous alone, but containing a challenge of fundamental kind that involved his very soul. No further thrill, however, awaited him immediately. He left his table before she did, having intercepted no slightest hint of desired acquaintanceship or intercourse. He, naturally, made no advances. She, equally, made no smallest sign. Her face remained hidden. He caught no flash of eyes, no gesture, no hint of possible invitation. He went upstairs to his dingy room and in due course fell asleep. The next day he saw her not. Her place in the dining room was empty. But in the late evening of the following day, as the soft spring of sunshine found him prepared for his postponed expedition, he met her suddenly on the stairs. He was going down with haversack and in walking kit to an early dinner when he saw her coming up. She was perhaps a dozen steps below him. They must meet. A wave of confused, embarrassed pleasure swept him. He realized that this was no chance meeting. She meant to speak to him. Violent attraction and an equally violent repulsion seized him. There was no escape, nor, had escape been possible, would he have attempted it. He went down 4 steps. She mounted 4 towards him. Then he took one, and she took one. They met. For a moment they stood level, while he shrank against the wall to let her pass. He had the feeling that, but for the support of that wall, he must have lost his balance and fallen into her, for the sunlight from the landing window caught her face and lit it, and she was younger, he saw, than he had thought, and far more comely. Her atmosphere enveloped him. The sense of attraction and repulsion became intense. She moved past him with the slightest possible bow of recognition. Then, having passed, she turned. She stood a little higher than himself. A step at most, and she thus looked down at him. Her eyes blazed into his. She smiled, and he was aware again of the domination and the sweetness. The perfume of her near presence drowned him. His head swam. "We count upon you," she said in a low, firm voice, as though giving a command. "I know we may. We do." And before he knew what he was saying, trembling a little between deep pleasure and a contrary impulse that sought to choke the utterance, he heard his own voice answering, "You can count upon me." And she was already halfway up the next flight of stairs ere he could move a muscle, or attempt to thread a meaning into the singular exchange. Yet meaning, he well knew, there was. She was gone. Her footsteps overhead had died away. He stood there trembling like a boy of 20, yet also like a man of 40 in whom fires, long dreaded, now blazed sullenly. She had opened the furnace door. The draught rushed through. He felt again the old unwelcome spell. He saw the twisted streets, mid-leaning gables and shadowy towers of a day forgotten. He heard the ominous murmurs of a crowd that thirsted for wheel and scaffold and fire. And aware of vengeance, sweet and terrible, aware, too, that he welcomed it, his heart was troubled and afraid. In a brief second the impression came and went. Following it swiftly, the sweetness of the woman swept him. He forgot his shrinking in a rush of wild, delicious pleasure. The intoxication in him deepened. She had recognized him. She had bowed and even smiled. She had spoken, assuming familiarity, intimacy, including him in her secret purposes. It was this sweet intimacy, cleverly injected, that overcame the repulsion he acknowledged, winning complete obedience to the unknown meaning of her words. This meaning, for the moment, lay in darkness. Yet it was a portion of his own self, he felt, that concealed it of set purpose. He kept it hid. He looked deliberately another way. For if he faced it with full recognition, he knew that he must resist it to the death. He allowed himself to ask vague questions, then let her dominating spell confuse the answers so that he did not hear them. The challenge to his soul, that is, he evaded. What is commonly called sex lay only slightly in his troubled emotions. Her purpose had nothing that kept step with chance acquaintanceship. There lay meaning, indeed, in her smile and voice, but these were no handmaids to a vulgar intrigue in a foreign hotel. Her will breathed cleaner air. Her purpose aimed at some graver, mightier climax than the mere subjection of an elderly victim like himself. That will, that purpose, he felt certain, were implacable as death. The resolve in those bold eyes was not a common one, for in some strange way he divined the strong maternity in her. The maternal instinct was deeply, even predominantly involved. He felt positive that a divine tenderness, deeply outraged, was a chief ingredient too. In some way, then, she needed him, yet not she alone, for the pronoun we was used. And there were others with her, in some way. Equally a part of him was already her and their accomplice, an unresisting slave, a willing co-conspirator. He knew one other thing, and it was this that he kept concealed so carefully from himself. His recognition of it was subconscious, possibly, but for that very reason true. Her purpose was consistent with the satisfaction at last of a deep instinct in him that clamored to no gratification. It was for these odd mingled reasons that he stood trembling when she left him on the stairs, and finally went down to his hurried meal with a heart that knew wonder, anticipation, and delight, but also dread. 3. The table in front of him remained unoccupied. His dinner finished, he went out hastily. As he passed through the crowded streets, his chief desire was to be quickly free of the old, muffled buildings and airless alleys, with their clinging atmosphere of other days. He longed for the sweet taste of the heights, the smells of the forest whither he was bound. This forêt verte, he knew, rolled for leagues toward the north, empty of houses as of human beings. It was the home of deer and birds and rabbits, of wild boar, too. There would be spring flowers among the brushwood, anemones, celandine, oxlip, daffodils. The vapors of the town oppressed him. The warm and heavy moisture stifled. He wanted space and the sight of clean, simple things that would stimulate his mind with lighter thoughts. He soon passed the Romp, skirted the ugly villas of modern Bihorel, and rising now with every step entered the Route Neuve. He went unduly fast. He was already above the cathedral spire. Below him the Seine meandered round the chalky hills laden with war barges, and across a dip, still pink in the afterglow, rose the blunt down of Bonsecours with its anti-aircraft batteries. Poetry and violent fact crashed everywhere. He longed to top the hill and leave these unhappy reminders of death behind him. In front of the sweet woods, already beckoned through the twilight. He hastened, yet while he deliberately fixed his imagination on promised peace and beauty, an undercurrent ran sullenly in his mind, busy with quite other thoughts. The unknown woman and her singular words, the following mystery of the ancient city, the soft, beating wonder of the two together, these worked their incalculable magic persistently about him. Repression merely added to their power. His mind was a prey to some shadowy, remote anxiety that, intangible, invisible, yet knocked with ghostly fingers upon some door of ancient memory. He watched the moon rise above the eastern ridge, and the west of the afterglow of sunset still hung red. But these did not hold his attention as they normally must have done. Attention seemed elsewhere. The undercurrent bore him down a siding into a backwater, as it were, that clamored for discharge. He thought suddenly then of weather, what he called German weather, that combination of natural conditions which so oddly favored the enemy always. It had often occurred to him as strange. On sea and land, mist, rain, and wind, the fog and drying sun worked ever on their side. The coincidence was odd, to say the least. And now this glimpse of rising moon and sunset sky reminded him unpleasantly of the subject. Legends of pagan weather gods passed through his mind like hurrying shadows. These shadows multiplied, changed form, vanished, and returned. They came and went with incoherence, a straggling stream rushing from one point to another, maneuvering for position, but all unled, unguided by his will. The physical exercise filled his brain with blood, and thought danced undirected, picture upon picture driving by, so that soon he slipped from German weather and pagan gods to the witchcraft of past centuries, of its alleged association with the natural powers of the elements, and thus, eventually, to his cherished beliefs that humanity had advanced. Such remnants of primitive days were grotesque superstition, of course. But had humanity advanced? Had the individual progressed after all? Civilization, was it not the merest artificial growth? And the old perplexity rushed through his mind again. The German barbarity and bloodlust, the savagery, the undoubted Sadic impulses, the frightfulness taught with cool calculation by their highest minds, approved by their professors, endorsed by their clergy, applauded by their women even. All the unwelcome, undesired thoughts came flocking back upon him, escorted by the trooping shadows. They lay, these questions, still unresolved within him. It was the undercurrent, flowing more swiftly now, that bore them to the surface. It had acquired momentum. It was leading somewhere. They were a thoughtful, intellectual race, these Germans. Their music, literature, philosophy, their science, How reconcile the opposing qualities? He had read that their herd instinct was unusually developed, though betraying the characteristics of a low, wild, savage type, the lupine. It might be true. Fear and danger wakened this collective instinct into terrific activity, making them blind and humorless. They fought best like wolves in contact. They howled and whined and boasted loudly all together to inspire terror. Their hymn of hate was but an elaboration of the wolf's fierce bark, giving them herd courage, and a savage discipline was necessary to their lupine type. These reflections thronged his mind as the blood coursed in his veins with the rapid climbing. Yet one and all, the beauty of the evening, the magic of the hidden town, the thoughts of German horror, German weather, German gods, all these, even the odd detail that they revived a pagan practice by hammering nails into effigies and idols, all led finally to one blazing center that nothing could dislodge nor anything conceal. A woman's voice and eyes. To these he knew quite well was due the undesired intensification of the very mood, the very emotions, the very thoughts he had come out on purpose to escape. "It is the night of the vernal equinox," occurred to him suddenly, sharp as a whispered voice beside him. He had no notion whence the idea was born. It had no particular meaning so far as he remembered. "It had then," said the voice imperiously, rising, it seemed, directly out of the undercurrent in his soul. It startled him. He increased his pace. He walked very quickly, whistling softly as he went. The dusk had fallen when at length he topped the long, slow hill and left the last of the atrocious, straggling villas well behind him. The ancient city lay far below in murky haze and smoke, but tinged now with the silver of the growing moon. 4. He stood now on the open plateau. He was on the heights at last. The night air met him freshly in the face so that he forgot the fatigue of the long climb uphill, taken too fast somewhat for his years. He drew a deep draught into his lungs and stepped out briskly. Far in the upper sky, light, flaky clouds raced through the reddened air, but the wind kept to these higher strata, and the world about him lay very still. Few lights showed in the farms and cottages, for this was the direct route of the Gothas, and nothing that could help the German hawks to find the river was visible. His mind cleared pleasantly. This keen, sweet air held no mystery. He put his best foot foremost, whistling still, but a little more loudly than before. Among the orchards he saw the daisies glimmer. Also he heard the guns, a thudding concussion in the direction of the coveted Amiens, where some 60 miles as the crow flies they roared their terror into the calm evening skies. He cursed the sound. In the town below it was not audible. Thought jumped then to the men who fired them, and so to the prisoners who worked on the roads outside the hospitals and camps he visited daily. He passed them every morning and night, and the NCO invariably saluted his Red Cross uniform, a salute he returned when he could not avoid it with embarrassment. One man in particular stood out clearly in this memory. He had exchanged glances with him, noted the expression of his face, the number of his gang printed on coat and trousers, 82. The fellow had somehow managed to establish a relationship. He would look up and smile or frown. If the news from his point of view was good, he smiled. If it was bad, he scowled. Once, insolently enough, when the Germans had taken Albert, Peronne, Bapaume, he grinned. Something about the sullen, close-cropped face, typically Prussian, made the other shudder. It was the visage of an animal, neither evil nor malignant, even good-natured sometimes when it smiled, yet of an animal that could be fierce with the lust of happiness, ferocious with delight. The sullen savagery of a human wolf lay in it somewhere. He pictured its owner, impervious to shame, to normal human instinct as civilized people know these. Doubtless he read his own feelings into it. He could imagine the man doing anything and everything, regarding chivalry and sporting instinct as proof of fear or weakness. He could picture this member of the wolf pack killing a woman or a child, mutilating, cutting off little hands even, with the conscientious conviction that it was right and sensible to destroy any individual of an enemy tribe. It was to him an atrocious and inhuman face. It now cropped up with unpleasant vividness, as he listened to the distant guns and thought of Amiens with its back against the wall, its inhabitants flying. Ah, Amiens. He again saw the woman staring into his obedient eyes across the narrow space between the tables. He smelt the delicious perfume of her dress and person on the stairs. He heard her commanding voice, her very words. "We count on you. I know we can. We do." And her background was of twisted streets, dark alleyways, and leaning gables. He hurried, whistling loudly, an air that he invented suddenly, using his stick like a golf club at every loose stone his feet encountered, making as much noise as possible. He told himself he was a parson and a Red Cross worker. He looked up and saw that the stars were out. The pace made him warm, and he shifted his haversack to the other shoulder. The moon, he observed, now cast his shadow for a long distance on the sandy road. After another mile, while the air grew sharper and twilight surrendered finally to the moon, the road began to curve and dip. The cottages lay farther out in the dim fields. The farms and barns occurred at longer intervals. A dog barked now and again. He saw cows lying down for the night beneath shadowy fruit trees. And then the scent in the air changed slightly, and a darkening of the near horizon warned him that the forest had come close. This was an event. Its influence breathed already a new perfume. The shadows from its myriad trees stole out and touched him. 10 minutes later he reached its actual frontier, cutting across the plateau like a line of sentries at attention. He slowed down a little. Here within sight and touch of his long-desired objective, he hesitated. It stretched, he knew from the map, for many leagues to the north, uninhabited, lonely, the home of peace and silence. There were flowers there, in cool, sweet spaces where the moonlight fell. Yet here, within scent and touch of it, he slowed down a moment to draw a breath. A forest on the map is one thing, visible before the eyes when night has fallen. It is another. It is real. The wind, not noticeable hitherto, now murmured towards him from the serried trees that seemed to manufacture darkness out of nothing. This murmur hummed about him. It enveloped him. Piercing it, another sound that was not the guns just reached him, but so distant that he hardly noticed it. He looked back. Dusk suddenly merged in night. He stopped. How practical the French are, he said to himself, aloud, as he looked at the road running straight as a ruled line into the heart of the trees. They waste no energy, no space, no time. Admirable. It pierced the forest like a lance, tapering to a faint point in the misty distance. The trees ate its undeviating straightness as though they would smother it from sight, as though its rigid outline marred their mystery. He admired the practical makers of the road, yet sided too with the poetry of the trees. He stood there, staring, waiting, dawdling. About him, save for this murmur of the wind, was silence. Nothing living stirred. The world lay extraordinarily still. That other distant sound had died away. He lit his pipe, glad that the match blew out and the damp tobacco needed several matches before the pipe drew properly. His puttees hurt him a little. He stooped to loosen them. His haversack swung round in front as he straightened up again. He shifted it laboriously to the other shoulder. A tiny stone in his right boot caused irritation. Its removal took a considerable time, for he had to sit down, and a log was not at once forthcoming. Moreover, the laces gave him trouble, and his fingers had grown thick with heat, and the knots were difficult to tie. "There," he said it aloud, standing up again. "Now at last I'm ready." Then added a mild imprecation, for his pipe had gone out while he stooped over the recalcitrant boot, and it had to be lighted once again. "Ah," he gasped finally with a sigh as, facing the forest for the third time, he shuffled his tunic straight, altered his haversack once more, changed his stick from the right hand to the left, and faced the foolish truth without further pretense. He mopped his forehead carefully, as though at the same time trying to mop away from his mind a faint anxiety, a very faint uneasiness that gathered there. Was someone standing near him? Had someone come close by? He listened intently. It was the blood singing in his ears, of course, that curious distant noise. For truth to tell, the loneliness bit just below the surface of what he found enjoyable. It seemed to him that somebody was coming, someone he could not see, so that he looked back over his shoulder once again, glanced quickly right and left, then peered down the long opening cut through the woods in front, when there came suddenly a roar and a blaze of dazzling light from behind, so instantaneously that he barely had time to obey the instinct of self-preservation and step aside. He actually leapt. Pressed against the hedge, he saw a motor car rush past him like a whirlwind, flooding the sandy road with fire. A second followed it, and to his complete amazement, then a third. They were powerful private cars, so-called. This struck him instantly. Two other things he noticed as they dived down the throat of the long white road. They showed no taillights. This made him wonder, and secondly, the drivers, clearly seen, were women. They were not even in uniform, which made him wonder even more. The occupants, too, were women. He caught the outline of toque and feather, or was it flowers, against the closed windows in the moonlight as the procession rushed past him. He felt bewildered and astonished. Private motors were rare, and military regulations exceedingly strict. The danger of spies dressed in French uniform was constant. Cars, armed with machine guns, he knew, patrolled the countryside in all directions. Shaken and alarmed, he thought of favored persons fleeing stealthily by night, of treachery, disguise, and swift surprise. He thought of various things as he stood peering down the road for 10 minutes after all sight and sound of the cars had died away. But no solution of the mystery occurred to him. Down the white throat the motors vanished. His pipe had gone out. He lit it and puffed furiously. His thoughts, at any rate, took temporarily a new direction now. The road was not as lonely as he had imagined. A natural reaction set in at once, and this proof of practical modern life banished the shadows from his mind effectually. He started off once more, oblivious of his former hesitation. He even felt a trifle shamed and foolish, pretending that the vanished mood had not existed. The tobacco had been damp. His boot had really hurt him. Yet bewilderment and surprise stayed with him. The swiftness of the incident was disconcerting. The cars arrived and vanished with such extraordinary rapidity. Their noisy eruption into this peaceful spot seemed incongruous. They roared, blazed, rushed, and disappeared. Silence resumed its former sway. But the silence persisted, whereas the noise was gone. This touch of the incongruous remained with him, as he now went ever deeper into the heart of the quiet forest. This odd incongruity of dreams remained. 5. The keen air stole from the woods, cooling his body and his mind. Anemones gleamed faintly among the brushwood, lit by the pallid moonlight. There were beauty, calm, and silence, the slow breathing of the earth beneath the comforting sweet stars. War, in this haunt of ancient peace, seemed an incredible anachronism. His thoughts turned to gentle, happy hopes of a day when the lion and the lamb would yet lie down together, and a little child would lead them without fear. His soul dwelt with peaceful longings and calm desires. He walked on steadily until the inflexible straightness of the endless road began to afflict him, and he longed for a turning to the right or left. He looked eagerly about him for a woodland path. Time mattered little. He could wait for the sunrise and walk home beneath the young gray dawn. He had food and matches. He could light a fire and sleep. No, after all, he would not light a fire, perhaps. He might be accused of signaling to hostile aircraft, or a garde forestière might catch him. He would not bother with a fire. The night was warm. He could enjoy himself and pass the time quite happily, without artificial heat. Probably he would need no sleep at all. And just then he noticed an opening on his right, where a seductive pathway led in among the trees. The moon, now higher in the sky, lit this woodland trail enticingly. It seemed the very opening he had looked for, and with a thrill of pleasure, he at once turned down it, leaving the ugly road behind him with relief. The sound of his footsteps hushed instantly on the leaves and moss. The silence became noticeable. An unusual stillness followed. It seemed that something in his mind was also hushed. His feet moved stealthily, as though anxious to conceal his presence from surprise. His steps dragged purposely. Their rustling through the thick dead leaves perhaps was pleasant to him. He was not sure. The path opened presently into a clearing where the moonlight made a pool of silver. The surrounding brushwood fell away, and in the center a gigantic outline rose. It was, he saw, a beech tree that dwarfed the surrounding forest by its grandeur. Its bulk loomed very splendid against the sky, a faint rustle just audible in its myriad tiny leaves. Dipped in the moonlight, it had such majesty of proportion, such symmetry, that he stopped in admiration. It was, he saw, a multiple tree, 5 stems springing with attempted spirals out of an enormous trunk. It was immense. It had a presence. The space framed it to perfection. The clearing evidently was a favorite resting place for summer picnickers, a playground probably for city children on holiday afternoons. Woodcutters, too, had been here recently, for he noticed piled brushwood ready to be carted. It indicated admirably, he felt, the limits of his night expedition. Here he would rest a while, eat his late supper, sleep perhaps round a small... No, again. A fire he need not make. A spark might easily set the woods ablaze. It was against both forest and military regulations. This idea of a fire, otherwise so natural, was distasteful, even repugnant to him. He wondered a little why it recurred. He noticed this time, moreover, something unpleasant connected with the suggestion of a fire, something that made him shrink. Almost a ghostly dread lay hidden in it. This startled him. A dozen excellent reasons supplied by his brain warned him that a fire was unwise. But the true reason, supplied by another part of him, concealed itself with care, as though afraid that reason might detect its nature and fix the label on. Disliking this reminder of his earlier mood, he moved forward into the clearing, swinging his stick aggressively and whistling. He approached the tree where a dozen thick roots dipped into the earth. Admiring, looking up and down, he paced slowly round its prodigious girth, then stood absolutely still. His heart stopped abruptly. His blood became congealed. He saw something that filled him with a sudden emptiness of terror. On this western side the shadow lay very black. It was between the thick limbs, half stem, half root, where the dark hollows gave easy hiding places, that he was positive he detected movement. A portion of the trunk had moved. He stood stock still and stared, not 3 feet from the trunk, when there came a second movement. Concealed in the shadows there crouched a living form. The movement defined itself immediately. Half reclining, half standing, a living being pressed itself close against the tree, yet fitting so neatly into the wide-scooped hollows that it was scarcely distinguishable from its ebony background. But for the chance movement he must have passed it undetected. Equally, his outstretched fingers might have touched it. The blood rushed from his heart as he saw this second movement. Detaching itself from the obscure background, the figure rose and stood before him. It swayed a little, then stepped out into the patch of moonlight on his left. 3 feet lay between them. The figure then bent over. Pallid face with burning eyes thrust forward and peered straight into his own. The human being was a woman. The same instant he recognized the eyes that had stared him out of countenance in the dining room 2 nights ago. He was petrified. She stared him out of countenance now. And as she did so, the undercurrent he had tried to ignore so long swept to the surface in a tumultuous flood, obliterating his normal self. Something elaborately built up in his soul by years of artificial training collapsed like a house of cards, and he knew himself undone. "They've got me," flashed dreadfully through his mind. It was again like a message delivered in a dream where the significance of acts performed and language uttered, concealed at the moment, is revealed much later only. "After all, they've got me." End of section 15. Vengeance is Mine, chapters 1 through 5. Section 16 of The Wolves of God and Other Fae Stories by Algernon Blackwood and Wilfred Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Vengeance is Mine. Chapter 6. The dialogue that followed seemed strange to him only when he looked back upon it. The element of surprise again was negligible, if not wholly absent, but the incongruity of dreams, almost of nightmare, became more marked. Though the affair was unlikely, it was far from incredible. So completely were this man and woman involved in some purpose common to them both, that their talk, their meeting, their instinctive sympathy at the time, seemed natural. The same stream bore them irresistibly towards the same far sea, only as yet this common purpose remained concealed, nor could he define the violent emotions that troubled him. Their exact description was in him, but so deep that he could not draw it up. Moonlight lay upon his thought, merging clear outlines. Divided against himself, the cleavage left no authoritative self in control. His desire to take an immediate decision resulted in a confused struggle, where shame and pleasure, attraction and revulsion mingled painfully. Incongruous details tumbled helter-skelter about his mind. For no obvious reason, he remembered again his Red Cross uniform, his former holy calling, his nationality, too. He was a servant of mercy, a teacher of the love of God. He was an English gentleman, against which rose other details, as in opposition, holding just beyond the reach of words, yet rising, he recognized well enough from the bedrock of the human animal, whereon a few centuries have imposed the thin crust of refinement men call civilization. He was aware of joy and loathing. In the first few seconds he knew the clash of a dreadful fundamental struggle, while the spell of this woman's strange enchantment poured over him, seeking the reconciliation he himself could not achieve. Yet the reconciliation she sought meant victory or defeat. No compromise lay in it. Something imperious emanating from her already dominated the warring elements towards a coherent whole. He stood before her, quivering with emotions he dared not name. Her great womanhood he recognized, acknowledging obedience to her undisclosed intentions. And this idea of coming surrender terrified him. Whence came, too, that queenly touch about her that made him feel he should have sunk upon his knees? The conflict resulted in a curious compromise. He raised his hand, he saluted, he found very ordinary words. "You passed me only a short time ago," he stammered. "In the motors, there were others with you." "Knowing that you would find us and come after, we count on your presence and your willing help." Her voice was firm, as with unalterable conviction. It was persuasive, too. He nodded, as though acquiescence seemed the only course. "We need your sympathy. We must have your power, too." He bowed again. "My power?" Something exulted in him. But he murmured only. It was natural, he felt. He gave consent without a question. Strange words he both understood and did not understand. Her voice, low and silvery, was that of a gentle, cultured woman, but command rang through it with a clang of metal, terrible behind the sweetness. She moved a little closer, standing erect before him in the moonlight, her figure borrowing something of the great tree's majesty behind her. It was incongruous, this gentle and yet sinister air she wore. Whence came, in this calm, peaceful spot, the suggestion of a wild and savage background to her? Why were there tumult and oppression in his heart? Pain, horror, tenderness, and mercy, mixed beyond disentanglement. Why did he think already but helplessly of escape, yet at the same time burn to stay? Whence came again, too, a certain queenly touch he felt in her? "The gods have brought you," broke across his turmoil in a half-whisper whose breath almost touched his face. "You belong to us." The deeps rose in him. Seduced by the sweetness and the power, the warring divisions in his being drew together. His under-self more and more obtained the mastery she willed. Then something in the French she used flickered across his mind, with a faint reminder of normal things again. "Belgian," he began, and then stopped short, as her instant rejoinder broke in upon his halting speech and petrified him. In her voice sang that triumphant tenderness that only the feminine powers of the universe may compass. It seemed the sky sang with her, the mating birds, wildflowers, the south wind, and the running streams. All these, even the silver birches, lent their fluid, feminine undertones to the two pregnant words with which she interrupted him, and completed his own unfinished sentence. "And, mother." With the dreadful calm of an absolute assurance, she stood and watched him. His understanding already showed signs of clearing. She stretched her hands out with a passionate appeal, a yearning gesture, the eloquence of which should explain all that remained unspoken. He saw their grace and symmetry, exquisite in the moonlight, then watched them fold together in an attitude of prayer. Beautiful mother hands they were, hands made to smooth the pillows of the world, to comfort, bless, caress, hands that little children everywhere must lean upon in love-perfect symbol of protective, self-forgetful motherhood. This tenderness he noted. He noted next the strength. In the folded hands he divined the expression of another great world power. Fulfilling the implacable resolution of the mouth and eyes, he was aware of relentless purpose, more of merciless revenge, as by a protective motherhood outraged beyond endurance. Moreover, the gesture held appeal. These hands, so close that their actual perfume reached him, sought his own in help. The power in himself as man, as male, as father, this was required of him in the fulfillment of the unknown purpose to which this woman summoned him. His understanding cleared still more. The couple faced one another, staring fixedly beneath the giant beech that overarched them. In the dark of his eyes, he knew lay growing terror. He shivered, and the shiver passed down his spine, making his whole body tremble. There, sitting in him an excitement he loathed, yet welcomed, as the primitive male in him, answering the summons, reared up with instinctive, dreadful glee to shatter the bars that civilization had so confidently set upon its freedom. A primal emotion of his underbeing, ancient lust that had too long gone hungry and unfed, leaped towards some possible satisfaction. It was incredible. It was, of course, a dream. But judgment wavered. Increasing terror ate his will away. Violence and sweetness, relief and degradation, fought in his soul as he trembled before a power that now slowly mastered him. This glee and loathing formed their ghastly partnership. He could have strangled the woman where she stood. Equally, he could have knelt and kissed her feet. The vehemence of the conflict paralyzed him. "A mother's hands," he murmured at length, the words escaping like bubbles that rose to the surface of a seething cauldron and then burst. And the woman smiled as though she read his mind and saw his little trembling. The smile crept down from the eyes towards the mouth. He saw her lips part slightly. He saw her teeth. But her reply once more transfixed him. 2 syllables she uttered in a voice of iron. "Louvain." The sound acted upon him like a word of power in some Eastern fairy tale. It knit the presence to a past that he now recognized could never die. Humanity had not advanced. The hidden source of his secret joy began to glow. For this woman focused in him passions that life had hitherto denied. Pretending they were atrophied, and the primitive male, the naked savage, rose up, with glee in its lustful eyes and blood upon its lips. Acquired civilization, a pitiful mockery, split through its thin veneer and fled. "Belgian, Louvain, mother," he whispered, yet astonished at the volume of sound that now left his mouth. His voice had a sudden fullness. It seemed a caveman roared the words. She touched his hand, and he knew a sudden intensification of life within him. Immense energy poured through his veins. A medieval spirit used his eyes. Great pagan instincts strained and urged against his heart, against his very muscles. He longed for action, and he cried aloud, "I am with you to the end." Her spell had vivified beyond all possible resistance that primitive consciousness which is ever the bedrock of the human animal. A racial memory, inset against the forest scenery, flashed suddenly through the depths laid bare. Below a sinking moon, dark figures flew in streaming lines and groups. Tormented cries went down the wind. He saw torn, blasted trees that swayed and rocked. There was a leaping fire, a gleaming knife, an altar. He saw a sacrifice. It flashed away and vanished. In its place the woman stood, with shining eyes fixed on his face, one arm outstretched, one hand upon his flesh. She shifted slightly, and her cloak swung open. He saw clinging skins wound closely about her figure. Leaves, flowers, and trailing green hung from her shoulders, fluttering down the lines of her triumphant physical beauty. There was a perfume of wild roses, incense, ivy bloom, whose subtle intoxication drowned his senses. He saw a sparkling girdle round the waist, a knife thrust through it tight against the hip. And his secret joy, the glee, the pleasure of some unlawful and unholy lust, leaped through his blood towards the abandonment of satisfaction. The moon revealed a glimpse, no more. An instant he saw her thus, half savage and half sweet, symbol of primitive justice entering the present through the door of vanished centuries. The cloak swung back again. The outstretched hand withdrew, but from a world he knew had altered. Today sank out of sight. The moon shone pale with terror and delight on yesterday. 7. Across this altered world a faint new sound now reached his ears, as though a human wail of anguished terror trembled and changed into the cry of some captured helpless animal. He thought of a wolf apart from the comfort of its pack, savage yet abject. The despair of a last appeal was in the sound. It floated past, it died away. The woman moved closer suddenly. "All is prepared," she said, in the same low, silvery voice. "We must not tarry. The equinox is come. The tide of power flows. The sacrifice is here. We hold him fast. We only waited you." Her shining eyes were raised to his. "Your soul is with us now?" she whispered. "My soul is with you." "And midnight," she continued, "is at hand. We use, of course, their methods. Henceforth the gods, their old-world gods, shall work on our side. They demand a sacrifice, and justice has provided one." His understanding cleared still more then. The last veil of confusion was drawing from his mind. The old names went thundering through his consciousness. Odin, Wotan, Moloch, accessible ever to invocation and worship of the rightful kind. It seemed as natural as though he read in his pulpit the prayer for rain, or gave out the hymn for those at sea. That was merely an empty form, whereas this was real. Sea, storm, and earthquake, all natural activities, lay under the direction of those elemental powers called the gods. Names changed, the principle remained. "Their weather shall be ours," he cried with sudden passion, as a memory of unhallowed usages he had thought erased from life burned in him, while stranger still resentment stirred, revolt, against the system, against the very deity he had worshipped hitherto. For these had never once interfered to help the cause of right. Their feebleness was now laid bare before his eyes, and a twofold lust rose in him. "Vengeance is ours," he cried in a louder voice, through which this sudden loathing of the cross poured hatred. "Vengeance and justice! Now, bind the victim, bring on the sacrifice." "He is already bound." And as the woman moved a little, the curious erection behind her caught his eye. The piled brushwood he had imagined was the work of woodmen, picnickers, or playing children. He realized its true meaning. It now delighted and appalled him. Awe deepened in him, a wind of ice passed over him. Civilization made one more fluttering effort. He gasped, he shivered, he tried to speak, but no words came. A thin cry, as of a frightened child, escaped him. "It is the only way," the woman whispered softly. "We steal from them the power of their own deities." Her head flung back with a marvelous gesture of grace and power. She stood before him a figure of perfect womanhood, gentle and tender, yet at the same time alive and cruel, with the passions of an ignorant and savage past. Her folded hands were clasped, her face turned heavenwards. "I am a mother," she added, with amazing passion, her eyes glistening in the moonlight with unshed tears. "We all," she glanced toward the forest, her voice rising to a wild and poignant cry, all of us are mothers." It was then the final clearing of his understanding happened, and he realized his own part in what would follow. Yet before the realization he felt himself not merely ineffective, but powerless. The struggling forces in him were so evenly matched that paralysis of the will resulted. His dry lips contrived merely a few words of confused and feeble protest.
"Me?"
he faltered.
"My help?"
"Justice," she answered, and though softly uttered, it was as though the medieval towers clanged their bells. That secret, ghastly joy again rose in him. Admiration, wonder, desire followed instantly. A fugitive memory of Joan of Arc flashed by as with armored wings upon the moonlight. Some power, similarly heroic, some purpose, similarly inflexible, emanated from this woman, the savor of whose physical enchantment, whose very breath, rose to his brain like incense. Again he shuddered. The spasm of secret pleasure shocked him. He sighed. He felt alert, yet stunned. Her words went down the wind between them.
"You are so weak, you English,"
he heard her terrible whisper.
"So nobly forgiving, so fine, yet so forgetful. You refuse the weapon they place within your hands."
Her face thrust closer. The great eyes blazed upon him.
"If we would save the children," the voice rose and fell like the wind, "we must worship where they worship. We must sacrifice to their savage deities."
The stream of her words flowed over him with this nightmare magic that seemed natural without surprise. He listened, he trembled, and again he sighed. Yet in his blood there was sudden roaring.
"Louvain, the hands of little children, we have the proof,"
he heard oddly intermingled with another set of words that clamored vainly in his brain for utterance.
"The diary in his own handwriting, his gloating pleasure, the little innocent hands."
"Justice is mine," rang through some fading region of his now fainting soul, but found no audible utterance.
"Mist, rain, and wind, the gods of German weather, we all are mothers."
"I will repay," came forth in actual words, yet so low he hardly heard the sound, but the woman heard.
"We," she cried fiercely, "we will repay."
"God," the voice seemed torn from his throat.
"Oh God, my God."
"Our gods," she said steadily in that tone of iron,
"are near. The sacrifice is ready, and you, servant of mercy, priest of a younger deity in English, you bring the power that makes it effectual. The circuit is complete."
It was perhaps the tears in her appealing eyes. Perhaps it was her words, her voice, the wonder of her presence, all combined possibly in the spell that finally then struck down his will, as with a single blow that paralyzed his last resistance. The monstrous, half-legendary spirit of a primitive day recaptured him completely. He yielded to the spell of this tender, cruel woman, mother and avenging angel, whom horror and suffering had flung back upon the practices of uncivilized centuries. A common desire, a common lust and purpose, degraded both of them. They understood one another, dropping back into a gulf of savage worship that set up idols in the place of God. They prayed to Odin and his awful crew. It was again the touch of her hand that galvanized him. She raised him. He had been kneeling in slavish wonder and admiration at her feet. He leaped to do the bidding, however terrible, of this woman who was priestess, queen indeed of a long-forgotten orgy. "Vengeance at last!" he cried, in an exultant voice that no longer frightened him. "Now, light the fire! Bring on the sacrifice!" There was a rustling among the nearer branches. The forest stirred. The leaves of last year brushed against advancing feet. Yet before he could turn to see, before even the last words had wholly left his lips, the woman whose hand still touched his fingers suddenly tossed her cloak aside, and flinging her bare arms about his neck, drew him with impetuous passion towards her face and kissed him, as with delighted fury of exultant passion, full upon the mouth. Her body and its clinging skins pressed close against his own. Her heat poured into him. She held him fiercely, savagely, and her burning kiss consumed his modern soul away with the fire of a primal day. "The gods have given you to us," she cried, releasing him. "Your soul is ours." She turned. They turned together, to look for one upon whose last hour the moon now shed her horrid silver. 8. The silvery moonlight fell upon the scene. Incongruously he remembered the flowers that soon would know the cuckoo's call. The soft, mysterious stars shone down. The woods lay silent underneath the sky. An amazing fantasy of dream shot here and there. "I am a man, an Englishman, a padre," ran twisting through his mind as though she whispered them to emphasize the ghastly contrast of reality. A memory of his own Kentish village with its Sunday school fled past. His dream of the lion and the lamb close after it. He saw children playing on the green. He saw their happy little hands. Justice, punishment, revenge, he could not disentangle them. No longer did he wish to. The tide of violence was at his lips. Quenching an ancient thirst, he drank. It seemed he could drink forever. These tender pictures only sweetened horror. That kiss had burned his modern soul away. The woman waved her hand. There swept from the underbrush a score of figures dressed like herself in skins, with leaves and flowers entwined among their flying hair. He was surrounded in a moment. Upon each face he noted the same tenderness and terrible resolve that their commander wore. They pressed about him, dancing with enchanting grace, yet with full-blooded abandon across the checkered light and shadow. It was the brimming energy of their movements that swept him off his feet, waking the desire for fierce, rhythmical expression. His own muscles leaped and ached. For this energy, it seemed, poured into him from the tossing arms and legs, the shimmering bodies whence hair and skins flung loose, setting the very air awhirl. It flowed over into inanimate objects even, so that the trees waved their branches although no wind stirred. Hair, skins, and hands, rushing leaves and flying fingers touched his face, his neck, his arms and shoulders, catching him away into this orgy of an ancient, sacrificial ritual. Faces with shining eyes peered into his, then sped away, grew in a cloud upon the moonlight, sank back in shadow, reappeared, touched him, whispered, vanished. Silvery limbs gleamed everywhere. Chanting rose in a wave, to fall away again into forest rustlings. There were smiles that flashed, then fainted into moonlight, red lips and gleaming teeth that shone then faded out. The secret glade, picked from the heart of the forest by the moon, became a torrent of tumultuous life, a whirlpool of passionate emotions time had not killed. But it was the eyes that mastered him, for in their yearning, mating so incongruously with the savage grace, in the eyes shone ever tears. He was aware of gentle women, of womanhood, of accumulated feminine power that nothing could withstand, but of feminine power and majesty, its essential protective tenderness roused as by tribal instinct into a collective fury of implacable revenge. He was above all aware of motherhood, of mothers, and the man, the male, the father in him rose like a storm to meet it. From the torrent of voices certain sentences emerged, sometimes chanted, sometimes driven into his whirling mind as though big whispers thrust them down his ears. "You are with us to the end," he caught. "We have the proof, and punishment is ours." It merged in wind, others took its place. "We hold him fast. The old gods wait and listen." The body of rushing whispers flowed like a storm wind past. A lovely face, fluttering close against his own, paused an instant, and starry eyes gazed into his with a passion of gratitude, dimming a moment their stern fury with a mother's tenderness. "For the little ones, it is necessary. It is the only way. Our own children." The face went out in a gust of blackness, as the chorus rose with a new note of awe and reverence, and a score of throats uttered in unison a single cry. "The raven, the white horses, his signs, great Odin hears." He saw the great dark bird flap slowly across the clearing, and melt against the shadow of the giant beech. He heard its hoarse, croaking note. The crowds of heads bowed low before its passage. The white horses he did not see. Only a sound as of considerable masses of air regularly displaced was audible far overhead. But the veiled light, as though great thunderclouds had risen, he saw distinctly. The sky above the clearing where he stood, panting and disheveled, was blocked by a mass that owned unusual outline. These clouds now topped the forest, hiding the moon and stars. The flowers went out like night lights blown. The wind rose slowly, then with sudden violence. There was a roaring in the treetops. The branches tossed and shook.
"The white horses!"
cried the voices in a frenzy of adoration.
"He is here!"
It came swiftly, this collective mass. It was both apt and terrible. There was an immense footstep. It was there. Then panic seized him. He felt an answering tumult in himself. The past surged through him like a sea at flood. Some inner sight, peering across the wreckage of today, perceived an outline that in its size dwarfed mountains, a pair of monstrous shoulders, a face that rolled through a full quarter of the heavens. Above the ruin of civilization, now fulfilled in the microcosm of his own being, the menacing shadow of a forgotten deity peered down upon the earth, yet upon one detail of it chiefly. The human group that had been wildly dancing, but that now chanted in solemn conclave about a forest altar. For some minutes a dead silence reigned. The pouring winds left emptiness, in which no leaf stirred. There was a hush, a stillness that could be felt. The kneeling figures stretched forth a level sea of arms towards the altar. From the lowered heads the hair hung down in torrents, against which the naked flesh shone white. The skins upon the rows of backs gleamed yellow. The obscurity deepened overhead. It was the time of adoration. He knelt as well, arms similarly outstretched, while the lust of vengeance burned within him. Then came across the stillness the stirring of big wings, a rustling as the great birds settled in the higher branches of the beech. The ominous note broke through the silence, and with one accord the shining backs were straightened. The company rose, swayed, parting into groups and lines. 200 voices resumed the solemn chant. The throng of pallid faces passed to and fro like great fireflies that shone and vanished. He, too, heard his own voice in unison, while his feet, as with the instinctive knowledge, trod the same measure that the others trod. Out of this tumult, and clearly audible above the chorus and the rustling feet, rang out suddenly, in a sweetly fluting tone, the leader's voice. "The fire! But first the hands!" A rush of figures set instantly towards a thicket where the underbrush stood densest. Skins, trailing flowers, bare waving arms and tossing hair swept past on a burst of perfume. It was as though the trees themselves sped by, and the torrent of voices shook the very air in answer.
"The fire! But first, the hands!"
Across this roaring volume pierced then, once again, that wailing sound which seemed both human and non-human. The anguished cry as of some lonely wolf in metamorphosis, apart from the collective safety of the pack, abjectly terrified, feeling the teeth of the final trap, and knowing the helpless feet within the steel. There was a crash of rending boughs and tearing branches. There was a tumult in the thicket, though of brief duration, then silence. He stood watching, listening, overmastered by a diabolical sensation of expectancy he knew to be atrocious. Turning in the direction of the cry, his straining eyes seemed filled with blood. In his temples the pulses throbbed and hammered audibly. The next second he stiffened into a stone-like rigidity as a figure, struggling violently yet half collapsed, was borne hurriedly past a score of eager arms that swept it towards the beech tree, and then proceeded to fasten it in an upright position against the trunk. It was a man bound tight with thongs, adorned with leaves and flowers and trailing green. The face was hidden, for the head sagged forward on the breast, but he saw the arms forced flat against the giant trunk, held helpless beyond all possible escape. He saw the knife, poised and aimed by slender, graceful fingers above the victim's wrists, laid bare. He saw the hands.
"An eye for an eye,"
he heard.
"A tooth for a tooth."
It rose in awful chorus. Yet this time, although the words roared close about him, they seemed farther away, as if wind brought them through the crowding trees from far off.
"Light the fire, prepare the sacrifice,"
came on a following wind, and while strange distance held the voices as before, a new faint sound now audible was very close. There was a crackling. Some 10 feet beyond the tree, a column of thick smoke rose in the air. He was aware of heat not meant for modern purposes, of yellow light that was not the light of stars. The figure writhed, and the face swung suddenly sideways, glaring with panic hopelessness. Past the judge, and past the hanging knife, the eyes found his own. There was a pause of perhaps 5 seconds, but in these 5 seconds, centuries rolled by. The priest of today looked down into the well of time. For 500 years he gazed into those twin eyeballs, glazed with the abject terror of a last appeal. They recognized one another. The centuries dragged appallingly. The drama of civilization in a sluggish stream went slowly by, halting, meandering, losing itself, then reappearing. Sharpest pains as of 1,000 knives accompanied its dreadful, endless lethargy. Its million hesitations made him suffer 1,000,000 deaths of agony. Terror, despair, and anger, all futile and without effect upon its progress, destroyed 1,000 times his soul, which yet some hope, a towering, indestructible hope, 1,000 times renewed. This despair and hope alternately broke his being, ever to fashion it anew. His torture seemed not of this world, yet hope survived. The sluggish stream moved onward, forward. There came an instant of sharpest, dislocating torture. The yellow light grew slightly brighter. He saw the eyelids flicker. It was at this moment he realized abruptly that he stood alone, apart from the others, unnoticed apparently, perhaps forgotten. His feet held steady, his voice no longer sang, and at this discovery a quivering shock ran through his being, as though the will were suddenly loosened into a new activity, yet an activity that halted between 2 terrifying alternatives. It was as though the flicker of those eyelids loosed a spring. 2 instincts, clashing in his being, fought furiously for the mastery. One, ancient as this sacrifice, savage as the legendary figure brooding in the heavens above him, battled fiercely with another, acquired more recently in human evolution, that had not yet crystallized into permanence. He saw a child, playing in a Kentish orchard with toys and flowers the little innocent hands made living. He saw a lowly manger, figures kneeling round it, and 1 star shining overhead in piercing and prophetic beauty. Thought was impossible. He saw these symbols only, as the 2 contrary instincts, alternately hidden and revealed, fought for permanent possession of his soul. Each strove to dominate him. It seemed that violent blows were struck that wounded physically. He was bruised, he ached, he gasped for breath. His body swayed, held upright only, it seemed, by the awful appeal in the fixed and staring eyes. The challenge had come at last to final action. The conqueror, he well knew, would remain an integral portion of his character, his soul. It was the old battle waged eternally in every human heart, in every tribe, in every race, in every period, the essential principle, indeed, behind the Great World War. In the stress and confusion of the fight, as the eyes of the victim, savage in victory, abject in defeat, the appealing eyes of that animal face against the tree stared with their awful blaze into his own. This flashed clearly over him. It was the battle between might and right, between love and hate, forgiveness and vengeance, Christ and the devil. He heard the menacing thunder of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Then above its angry volume rose suddenly another small silvery voice that pierced with sweetness. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," sang through him as with unimaginable hope. Something became incandescent in him then. He realized a singular merging of powers in absolute opposition to each other. It was as though they harmonized. Yet it was through this small silvery voice the apparent magic came. The words, of course, were his own in memory, but they rose from his modern soul, now reawakening. He started painfully. He noted again that he stood apart, alone, perhaps forgotten of the others. The woman, leading a dancing throng about the blazing brushwood, was far from him. Her mind, too, sure of his compliance, had momentarily left him. The chain was weakened. The circuit knew a break. But this sudden realization was not of spontaneous origin. His heart had not produced it of its own accord. The unholy tumult of the orgy held him too slavishly in its awful sway for the tiny point of his modern soul to have pierced it, thus unaided. The light flashed to him from an outside natural source of simple loveliness, the singing of a bird. From the distance, faint and exquisite, there had reached him the silvery notes of a happy thrush, awake in the night, and telling its joy over and over again to itself. The innocent beauty of its song came through the forest and fell into his soul. The eyes, he became aware, had shifted, focusing now upon an object nearer to them. The knife was moving. There was a convulsive wriggle of the body. The head dropped loosely forward. No cry was audible. But at the same moment the inner battle ceased and an unexpected climax came. Did the soul of the bully faint with fear? Did the spirit leave him at the actual touch of earthly vengeance? The watcher never knew. In that appalling moment when the knife was about to begin the mission that the fire would complete, the roar of inner battle ended abruptly, and that small silvery voice drew the words of invincible power from his reawakening soul. "Ye do it also unto me," pealed over the forest. He reeled. He acted instantaneously. Yet before he had dashed the knife from the hand of the executioner, scattering the pile of blazing wood, plunged through the astonished worshippers with a violence of strength that amazed even himself, before he had torn the thongs apart and loosened the fainting victim from the tree, before he had uttered a single word or cry, though it seemed to him he roared with a voice of thousands, he witnessed a sight that came surely from the heaven of his earliest childhood days, from that heaven whose God is love, and whose forgiveness was taught him at his mother's knee. With superhuman rapidity, it passed before him and was gone. Yet it was no earthly figure that emerged from the forest, ran with this incredible swiftness past the startled throng, and reached the tree. He saw the shape. The same instant it was there, wrapped in light as though a flame from the sacrificial fire flashed past him over the ground. It was of an incandescent brightness, yet brightest of all were the little outstretched hands. These were of purest gold, of a brilliance incredibly shining. It was no earthly child that stretched forth these arms of generous forgiveness and took the bewildered prisoner by the hand just as the knife descended and touched the helpless wrists. The thongs were already loosened, and the victim, fallen to his knees, looked wildly this way and that for a way of possible escape, when the shining hands were laid upon his own. The murderer rose. Another instant and the throng must have been upon him, tearing him limb from limb, but the radiant little face looked down into his own. She raised him to his feet. With superhuman swiftness she led him through the infuriated concourse as though he had become invisible, guiding him safely past the furies into the cover of the trees. Close before his eyes this happened. He saw the waft of golden brilliance. He heard the final gulp of it, as wind took the dazzling of its fiery appearance into space. They were gone. 9. He stood watching the disappearing motor cars, wondering uneasily who the occupants were and what their business, whither and why did they hurry so swiftly through the night. He was still trying to light his pipe, but the damp tobacco would not burn. The air stole out of the forest, cooling his body and his mind. He saw the anemones gleam. There was only peace and calm about him. The earth lay waiting for the sweet, mysterious stars. The moon was higher. He looked up. A late bird sang. 3 strips of cloud, spaced far apart, were the footsteps of the south wind, as she flew to bring more birds from Africa. His thoughts turned to gentle, happy hopes of a day when the lion and the lamb should lie down together, and a little child should lead them. War, in this haunt of ancient peace, seemed an incredible anachronism. He did not go further. He did not enter the forest. He turned back along the quiet road he had come, ate his food on a farmer's gate, and over a pipe sat dreaming of his sure belief that humanity had advanced. He went home to his hotel soon after midnight. He slept well, and next day walked back the 4 miles from the hospitals, instead of using the car. Another hospital searcher walked with him. They discussed the news. "The weather's better, anyhow," said his companion. "In our favor at last." "That's something," he agreed as they passed a gang of prisoners and crossed the road to avoid saluting. "Been another escape, I hear," the other mentioned. "He won't get far. How on earth do they manage it? The M.O. had a yarn that he was helped by a motor car. I wonder what they'll do to him." "Oh, nothing much. Bread and water and extra work, I suppose." The other laughed. "I'm not so sure," he said lightly. "Humanity hasn't advanced very much in that kind of thing." A fugitive memory flashed for an instant through the other's brain as he listened. He had an odd feeling for a second that he had heard this conversation before somewhere. A ghostly sense of familiarity brushed his mind, then vanished. At dinner that night, the table in front of him was unoccupied. He did not, however, notice that it was unoccupied. End of section 16. Vengeance is Mine. End of The Wolves of God and Other Faith Stories by Algernon Blackwood and Wilfred Wilson.